Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first time I heard that door slam open at 3 a.m. like it happened last night. There was no gentle creak, no subtle warning, just a thunderous crash that shook the walls and tore me out of an uneasy sleep. Even as I write this, my hands tremble with the memory of that deafening sound, a bolt of terror slicing through the silence. I live at the very end of a narrow, isolated street. Only a few houses dot the path leading up to mine, and most of them remain dark at night, their occupants either away or locked tight behind thick walls. Even when the moon is full, the street lamps barely cast enough light to make out silhouettes, and the rustling of wind through twisted tree branches can send shivers through the bravest soul. It's an eerie setting on its own, but until recently, I never truly feared it. Now, it feels like a trap. And every time I hear that door fly open, I feel as if something cold and relentless is creeping closer to me. That first night I sat upright in bed, heart hammering, my mouth instantly going dry. I recall stumbling out of the sheets and fumbling for my glasses on the bedside table. My chest felt tight, and every breath I took sounded far too loud in the silence. My brain tried to rationalize it as the wind, or maybe a stray animal pushing against a loose latch. But the moment my bare feet hit the cold floor, I felt a deep certainty that there was no normal explanation for what I'd just heard. I crept down the hallway, each board beneath me groaning under my weight, the old house protesting with every step. My own pulse throbbed in my ears, and I had the unsettling impression that someone, was breathing just behind me. When I finally reached the living room, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into my bones. The front door, which I'd locked and bolted before going to bed, was standing wide open. A gust of night air pushed past me, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. I froze in place, scanning the darkness beyond the threshold. The street lay empty, no movement except the flickering streetlight in the distance. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In a panic, I shut the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and double-checked the lock 3 times. Then I scrambled around for something, anything to reinforce it. I grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it beneath the handle. Still, my heart refused to settle. I forced myself back to bed, telling myself there must be a logical explanation, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The next morning, exhaustion weighed me down as I went about my routine. A neighbor passed by, and though he greeted me politely, his eyes flicked over my house with a look of caution. He asked if I'd heard any strange noises overnight, and I admitted I had, but I avoided giving details. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. He shrugged and suggested it was probably the wind off the nearby hill, which sometimes rattled older homes. I gave a strained nod and said I'd keep an eye on it. The second night, I reinforced the door with all the means I had. Chains, boards nailed across the frame, and multiple locks. I remember feeling ridiculous as I hammered nails into the wooden planks, sweat beading on my forehead even though the air was cool. My breath caught in my throat each time the hammer struck. I hated how desperate I felt, as though caging myself inside my own home was somehow the only solution. My rational side argued that I was overreacting. Yet the memory of that door crashing open at 3 a.m. sent waves of dread through me I couldn't ignore. By the time I finished, the door looked more like the entrance to a boarded-up warehouse than a typical suburban home. Satisfied I had done enough, I ate a silent dinner, then watched television in an attempt to numb my anxieties. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep on the couch. The hours ticked by, the hush of the night settling over everything. At some point, the house grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your skin and makes your muscles clench involuntarily. At exactly 3 a.m., the door banged open again with a thunderous crash. The impact rattled the walls so hard I nearly fell off the couch. My lungs seized up, and I felt my heart plunge into my stomach. The boards, chains, locks, everything I'd done was undone. The door gaped open, as though nothing had ever been nailed to it. For a moment, I just stared at it, every hair on my arms and neck standing on end, a wave of ice-cold terror wrapping itself around me. Outside, the darkness stared back, silent and oppressively still. I couldn't see a person, or an animal, or even a wisp of fog. Yet I sensed a presence, a potent aura that made my legs tremble. My skin felt clammy, and my breaths became shallow. It felt wrong, as though the very air had grown heavy with malevolence. I inched forward, fear gnawing at my insides, each step more difficult than the last. I forced myself to close the door again, securing it as best I could, though it felt futile. My hands shook uncontrollably and a chill sweat broke out along my temples. I could almost taste the fear in my mouth, bitter and metallic. Later, I sat in a daze, trying to rationalize the irrational, until dawn offered a feeble sense of relief. After that second night, I decided I needed proof of what was happening. Maybe if I played back a recording, I could discover some pattern, a gust of wind, perhaps, or a structural fault in the house. Something that would make sense of this nightmare. So on the third night, I set up a small digital voice recorder near the entrance. The battery was fresh, and I placed it on a table close to the door. Then I left it running overnight. I couldn't sleep though. My body was tense, my mind alive with paranoia. I kept imagining footsteps in the hallway, the faint shuffle of something just beyond my field of vision. I half expected to see a shape standing in the corner whenever I turned my head. Several times I snapped on the hallway light, only to find emptiness. Each flick of the switch made my heart pound louder, adrenaline coursing through me. Hours crawled by until I saw the clock inch closer to that dreaded time. That night, strangely, the door did not slam open at 3 a.m. Instead, around 2:50, I felt a cold draft snake its way through the hallway. The temperature drop was sudden and shocking, making my skin prickle and my teeth chatter. My breath condensed as if I stood in a winter storm, even though it was mild outside. I heard no loud crash this time. Instead, there was a soft, almost inaudible click, as though a lock were being disengaged. Then a rush of cold air. My heart started hammering again, and my hands felt moist with sweat. I forced myself to check, only to find the door slightly ajar, the chain dangling uselessly, the boards still in place but shifted as though someone had carefully bent them aside. The hush in the air was terrifying. My pulse pounded, and I felt my vision blur around the edges, fear threatening to overwhelm me. In the morning, I reviewed the recorder's audio. There was a lot of static for the first few hours, punctuated only by my own restless movements in the house. Footsteps, the rustle of blankets, the occasional creak of old floorboards. Then, at around 2:50, the audio dipped into a strange silence, as if the microphone had stopped picking up ambient noise. A moment later, I heard something that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. A ragged, uneven breathing, like someone suffering from a lung condition or struggling to inhale. The sound scratched across my nerves. Then I heard my name repeated, whispered in a low, rasping voice. Each repetition seemed more intense, more urgent, until it broke into a chilling, breathy laugh that curdled my blood. Listening to it made me lightheaded, as though I was on the brink of fainting. I replayed it once more to convince myself it hadn't been my imagination, but it only sounded worse on the second listen. The voice was undeniably real, and it was in my house. With no other idea of what to do, I considered bringing someone else in, maybe a friend or an expert on abnormal phenomena. But the thought of explaining this to another person seemed impossible. I felt sure they would brand me delusional. I also dreaded the possibility that having another witness wouldn't stop this thing and would only confirm that whatever was tormenting me could strike at will, unstoppable. The day passed in a blur of anxiety, with me glancing at the door every few minutes, half convinced I would see it slowly opening on its own. That evening, I tried to steel myself. If this presence wanted something, I needed to at least attempt to confront it. So I removed all barricades. No boards, no extra locks, just the door. the single deadbolt, and me. My plan was to sit in the living room, lights off, and wait. I wanted to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever force was violating my home night after night. A twisted part of me felt that if I could see it, I might understand it. But in the back of my mind, I wondered if seeing it would be worse than not knowing. The wait was agonizing. Every second felt stretched thin, as if the night would never end. I tried to keep calm, but my heart raced incessantly, and every small noise in the house amplified in my mind. The refrigerator humming sounded like a distant growl. The wind outside whispered through the eaves, carrying what could have been phantom voices. My arms were covered in goosebumps, and my throat felt parched no matter how much water I drank. Finally, around 3 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted again, and the overhead light flickered for an instant. I saw a faint shape, or perhaps a distortion, move past the front window. My spine stiffened, and I gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that my knuckles ached. I tried to control my breathing, but panic was already clawing at me. The deadbolt turned with a metallic click, as if someone had a key on the other side. Then the door swung inward, slower than usual, revealing the silent street beyond. There was no figure standing there, no visible intruder, but the sense of a presence, of eyes upon me, was overpowering. I forced myself to stand up, though my legs felt weak. I approached the open door, fighting against every instinct screaming at me to flee. Cold sweat trickled down my back, making my skin clammy. My shirt clung to me, damp with terror. When I reached the threshold, I felt the temperature drop even lower, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath formed a ghostly cloud in front of me. In that moment, I silently demanded that it show itself, or speak, or do something other than torture me with these nightly invasions. A faint whisper drifted past my ear. My name, spoken so intimately it made my skin crawl. Then I felt a brush of icy air against my cheek. My stomach lurched, and I staggered backward, nearly losing my balance. Something flickered at the edge of my vision, like a silhouette in the periphery. But when I whipped my head around, there was only darkness and the faint glimmer of streetlights. The door, untouched by human hands, creaked shut again, the latch clicking softly into place. After that night, I realized I wasn't merely dealing with a random haunting or an intruder. This thing was methodical, almost curious. It came at the same hour, as though checking on me, testing the boundaries of my sanity. Every day I found new evidence that my reality was no longer stable. Sometimes I would discover puddles of near-freezing water in front of the door, or strange scratch marks along the inside of the frame. On one occasion, I woke up to see that every picture frame in the living room had turned to face the wall. I felt eyes on me constantly, like I was never alone in my own home. My nerves frayed under the relentless tension, sleep became rare, and my paranoia soared to new heights. I started seeing fleeting shapes in mirrors, fleeting distortions in corners, and hearing faint echoes of that ragged breathing when I tried to rest. I questioned my sanity over and over. Maybe I had internalized some trauma that was now manifesting in these hallucinations. But then I would remember the audio recording, the undeniable proof that something external was happening. People around me noticed my deterioration. A coworker mentioned I looked pale and jumpy, but I never gave him the real reason. I just said I wasn't sleeping well. As my mental state deteriorated, I considered moving out. But the thought of leaving felt strangely futile. I had a haunting suspicion that this presence wouldn't vanish just because I ran away. It felt personal, attached. I wondered if it was bound to me rather than to the house. Each attempt to rationalize it led me back to the same conclusion. I had to confront it, or at least survive it, here. The final confrontation came one night when I decided I'd had enough. I prepared myself mentally, insisting I was done living with this terror. At 3 a.m., the door tore open as usual. No dramatic crash this time, just a slow, deliberate swing. The boards I'd nailed up were gone and the chain dangled uselessly. My body trembled, but I forced myself to stand at the threshold. I could sense the cold presence, swirling in the darkness like a vortex of shadows and half-formed shapes. My heart pounded so violently that my entire chest ached. I braced myself and demanded, out loud, that it leave me alone, that it stop tormenting me. My voice cracked and my throat burned, but I repeated my plea with as much resolve as I could muster. The air felt heavy, pressing against me from all sides. My head spun, and I thought I heard that ragged breathing right next to my ear. For a split second, I feared I would pass out, but a surge of adrenaline kept me on my feet. I felt, rather than saw, the presence recoil, like a wave drawing back into the ocean. In the silence that followed, the door shut softly. Then the house grew still again, the air losing its chill. I stayed awake until dawn, unsure whether I had vanquished my tormentor or only stunned it. Over the next few weeks, the nightly intrusions tapered off. Some nights, the door stayed closed entirely. On others, I would catch it shifting on its hinges, as if tested by a faint breeze. But I never again heard that ragged breathing or that chilling whisper calling my name. It was as though the presence had acknowledged my confrontation and had, for the moment, retreated. Even so, I never truly felt the grip of fear release me. I find myself sleeping only a few hours a night, waking at every minor creak. Whenever 3 a.m. rolls around, my skin prickles in anticipation. The door remains closed now, held by its lock and my shaky resolve. But I know something lingers, a residue of whatever came through that threshold on those terrifying nights. I suspect it's watching, biding its time, eager to see if my courage can truly hold. I can't say I found a grand solution or discovered the true nature of the presence that haunted me. But in standing firm, I seem to have gained a temporary reprieve. Sometimes I consider leaving altogether, packing my things and starting fresh in a livelier, sunlit neighborhood. Yet, I hesitate. Part of me fears that if I don't stand my ground, this entity might follow me wherever I go. Another part wonders if I somehow belong here, at the end of this lonely street, locked in a quiet standoff with something I can barely comprehend. Every now and then, I still hear faint echoes in the walls, soft murmurs and something that might be laughter. My chest tightens whenever it happens, and I wonder if the next instant will bring back the slamming door, the gust of icy wind, and that voice whispering my name. As the days wear on, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, only dormant. The sense of being watched, of sharing my space with an unseen presence, never truly left. Even now, as I glance at the door, a chill dances along my spine. I ask myself if it's just my imagination, or if something stands on the other side, waiting to see if I will falter once more. That lingering question keeps me on edge, leaving me with a persistent unease I can't quite dispel. Perhaps I drove the presence away, or perhaps it's just allowing me a moment of peace, time enough to question my own perception and sanity. For now, I remain in this house, uncertain but stubborn, enduring the silent nights and the ever-present dread of what might happen when the clock strikes 3 a.m. again. And though I've stayed here longer than any sensible person would, I'm not defeated. Whatever lurks in the shadows knows I'm still here, standing guard at the end of my lonely street, determined to face whatever horror might once again pry open that door. I first noticed the red chalet on one of those dusky evenings when the sky is neither fully illuminated nor dark enough to conceal shadows. The building stood on the outskirts of a dirt road, leaning slightly to one side as though the earth itself were trying to swallow it. A thick cluster of trees framed its yard, their branches twisting overhead in a near-tangible hush. Something about that chalet felt off from the very first glance, a subtle churn in my gut that warned me not to linger. But I kept walking every day, telling myself I was just passing by, that I had nothing to fear. How naive that was. If I could go back, I would avoid that path entirely. But it's too late. My mind is filled with images of that scarlet structure, haunting me as vividly as any nightmare. I'm an ordinary man, living in a small town that offers more farmland and wooded paths than modern amenities. I enjoy long walks, especially when my thoughts get cluttered. There's peace in the rhythm of boots crunching gravel, in the distant chatter of birds. That dirt road I mentioned stretches between open fields, eventually merging with a narrow lane that leads into a patch of forest. At the edge of that forest stands the red chalet. I remember the first few times I went by it, noticing the paint flaking in places, the windows smeared with dust. No signs of life, no vehicles, no lights, just emptiness. Yet during one particular twilight, I caught sight of a couple on the veranda. My heart kicked up an extra beat because I was certain the place was abandoned. They were hazy, like I was viewing them through heat waves or looking at a reflection in rippling water. The man and woman stood close together, their heads tilted slightly as if they were listening to something just beyond my hearing. The man might have had a short brim hat, though it was impossible to be sure, while the woman's hair was pinned in a style reminiscent of decades past. I blinked, and they vanished. Strangely, their silhouettes remained on the wall behind them, still etched in shadow as if the sun were shining directly on them. I had no explanation. I stood there, each breath catching in my throat, heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my neck. My palms turned clammy. I wanted to step closer, to prove to myself it was some optical illusion, but a sudden chill across my back convinced me to keep my distance. All week, I couldn't shake that memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blurred figures fading in and out, leaving only their dark outlines. Then, the next time I walked by, I brought a camera, an old digital point-and-shoot that had never failed me. I thought I would snap a few photos of the chalet and the veranda, just to see if anything odd appeared on film. As I approached, an uneasy silence cloaked the scene. The wind seemed to die, and even the distant crow calls vanished. The door to the chalet looked slightly ajar. I tried to zoom in, my hands trembling so much that the lens shook. My heart was racing, and my throat felt parched, as though each swallow scraped against sandpaper. When I pressed the shutter button, the camera beeped, then flickered off. Dead battery, it seemed. But I'd charged it the night before. I switched it on again, and it died again. Once more, I attempted to power it up, only to see the lens retract automatically. It was inexplicable. My heart pounded as a surge of cold dread washed down my neck, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I whispered a string of curses under my breath, though I'm not sure if I was cursing the camera or my own jittery nerves. I told myself to leave, to forget the whole thing. But something compelled me to step forward, just a little closer to the porch. I kept scanning for signs of life, half expecting the couple to reappear. Instead, I saw emptiness. The floorboards were covered in a fine layer of dust, the wood rotted in spots. I craned my neck toward one of the windows. Inside, I could make out the barest suggestion of furniture, shapes in the shadows, a couch or a large chair perhaps. But as I stood there straining to see more, a voice seemed to echo from within. It was low, too muffled to parse into words, yet it felt insistent, like a whisper carried by a draft. The voice seeped into my chest, stirring an odd panic that made my pulse accelerate until I had to catch my breath. Sweat collected at my temples and I felt lightheaded. The voice faded, but my unease swelled. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I also felt a bizarre magnetism, an urge to open that door fully and peer into the gloom. In the end, my better sense prevailed. My hands shook so violently that I could hardly keep them at my sides. My breath grew ragged, as though I'd been sprinting, and I stepped away. That was enough. I walked briskly home, ignoring the creeping suspicion that something was watching me from the veranda. Over the ensuing days, the chalet intruded on my thoughts more and more. Every time I tried to do something else, cook, read, even watch TV, my mind drifted back to that isolated structure. I told a friend about it, in a vague, indirect way, omitting the strangest details. He suggested it was probably just an old house with some local legends attached. He mentioned that if I felt uneasy, I should stay away or maybe talk to a neighbor who might know its history. That was the gist of his advice, told to me over a quick coffee. I nodded along, but it didn't alleviate the sense of dread. It was like something had latched onto me, a tether that kept me psychologically bound to that veranda and the shadows on the wall. Curiosity eventually won out. I reasoned that if I could understand what was happening, maybe I'd feel less haunted. So one late afternoon, under a bruised sky that threatened a storm, I set out again. My heart beat a dull, heavy rhythm in my chest, and a cold sweat had already formed on my palms before I was even within view of the chalet. I clutched my phone as I walked, occasionally checking the battery just to be sure it was fully charged. As I approached, I felt the same unnatural hush blanket the surroundings. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of insects. The chalet rose up like a specter at the edge of the clearing, its red paint now seeming darker than I remembered, as though stained by shadows. I tried taking photos with my phone this time. The camera app crashed repeatedly. Each attempt ended with a black screen and an error message I had never seen before. My mouth went dry, and my throat tightened in that anxious way that precedes panic. The phone felt useless in my hand, an expensive piece of tech that wouldn't function in the presence of something it didn't know how to interpret. Squeezing it until my knuckles turned white, I had an urge to fling it into the forest, but I controlled myself. The door was still ajar, slightly more open than last time. The interior lay draped in shadows, yet from where I stood, I saw no real sign of occupancy. Nevertheless, the air vibrated with the impression that someone, or something, was inside, waiting. My legs felt shaky, my breath came fast, and my ears rang with a high-pitched whine that grew louder the longer I remained rooted in that spot. I forced my eyes to focus on the doorframe, hoping to see some rational explanation. Maybe a homeless drifter had taken refuge, or a neglected cat had slipped in. But that hope vanished when I heard those voices again, this time more distinct, though still impossible to decipher. I stepped onto the first porch step. The wood creaked beneath my weight, and I felt an immediate jolt of alarm flare in my gut. I thought I heard the faintest hush of footsteps beyond the threshold. My heart hammered as if attempting to break through my ribcage. I found myself trembling, my breath turning shallow. The sweat on my brow felt icy against the evening chill. I wanted to run, but I also yearned to see if those blurred figures would appear. Gathering a momentary surge of courage, I lifted my head and peered through the doorway. A single corridor extended inward, lined with peeling wallpaper whose pattern might once have been roses. The air inside looked gray, as if dust motes had formed a hovering cloud. I forced my gaze to adjust to the dimness. Nothing moved, but I sensed a presence drifting nearby, so potent it made my scalp prickle. The voices continued their murmuring, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. My heart pounded so violently that each throb sent a tremor through my arms and legs. A dull ache formed at the base of my neck, and breathing became a conscious effort. I resisted the temptation to call out. Instinct told me that if I made a sound, it might provoke something that was better left alone. Instead, I carefully placed one foot on the threshold. The rotted floorboard sagged slightly and I froze. That was all it took for me to realize how horrifyingly alone I was, and how unprepared. My phone was worthless, and I had no idea who or what might be lurking in the gloom. I slowly backed away, every muscle tensing in anticipation of being grabbed or pushed. But nothing happened, at least nothing tangible. The corridor stayed silent except for the faint echo of those unearthly whispers. I retreated to the safety of the porch, feeling as though I had stepped out of a dream that left my heart pounding and my skin clammy. Outside, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Whirling around, I expected to see the couple again. Instead, I saw only the same veranda and its peeling paint. Yet the shadows on the wall shifted, as if someone had just stepped away from them. It made no sense. My heart pounded so loud in my ears that I could hardly hear my own ragged breathing. Then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered reading somewhere that certain hauntings can exist in layers, as though time itself has fractured. My rational mind scoffed at the notion, but I couldn't deny the growing certainty that I was witnessing something trapped between dimensions. I practically stumbled off the porch, my legs shaking. The sky had darkened considerably. The sunset was almost gone, leaving behind an oppressive twilight. I took off down the road at a brisk pace, glancing back only once. That was a mistake. The couple was there again, faint as smoke, standing on the veranda. Their faces were still blurred, but they appeared to be turned in my direction. I blinked hard. They vanished, and yet their shadows remained plastered against the chalet's wall, elongated by the dying light. It felt like a warning, or maybe a plea for help. Either possibility turned my blood cold. For days afterward, I stayed indoors as much as possible, but my mind could not let go of what I had witnessed. I felt nauseous whenever I thought about it too long, and I found myself on edge, jumping at small sounds in my own house. My heart would skip a beat if the floor creaked at night, or if a branch scraped a window in the wind. I questioned my sanity, wondering if stress or a mild hallucination might explain the phenomenon. But deep down, I suspected it was real. That sense of being watched had lodged itself in my psyche, fueling a paranoia that kept me awake at night with sweat dripping down my back. My sense of reality felt warped. Ordinary objects, like the coat rack in the hallway, suddenly seemed ominous in the corner of my eye, as if everything around me might morph into some twisted reflection of that cursed chalet. Eventually, I decided I needed closure, some definitive confrontation. If it was an illusion, I wanted to prove it. If it was something beyond my comprehension, I hoped to at least understand enough to feel less powerless. One final time, I marched down that dirt road, ignoring the creeping dread that had become an almost physical weight pressing on my shoulders. The sun was setting again. It always seemed to be twilight when I ventured there, as though my visits were locked to that liminal hour. When I arrived, the chalet was bathed in the last rays of a dying sun, its crimson walls reflecting a shade that looked almost black. The porch lay in deep shadow, the door open wider than ever before, practically inviting me. I stepped forward. My body trembled so fiercely that I had to steady myself against the railing. Beneath my hand, the wood felt damp and cold, sending a bolt of revulsion through me. I glanced at the wall where I'd seen those impossible silhouettes. They flickered there for an instant. My eyes definitely caught the shift of darkness, but then they disappeared. Gathering the remnants of my courage, I walked inside. The floorboards groaned, and the air felt thick, like I was wading through water. The corridor stretched ahead, leading into a space that might have been a living room. As I inched forward, a low, droning murmur reverberated around me. It sounded like 1,000 faint voices speaking all at once. My heart thrummed, each beat resonating in my skull. My forehead beaded with sweat, and my breath came in shallow spurts. I didn't dare call out. My instincts told me to keep silent, to remain an observer in this strange realm. I passed by what looked like a living area, where a threadbare sofa sat under a broken window. The stench of damp wood and mold assaulted me, making my stomach lurch. I held an arm up to cover my nose. A single hallway led to a staircase, its steps disappearing into darkness. Something moved at the top, an indistinct shape gliding across the landing. My heart hammered like a desperate drum, urging me to leave. But a twisted part of me needed to know. I took one step onto the staircase. A loud snap echoed, and the step cracked under my weight. I caught my balance just in time, adrenaline surging so violently that my vision momentarily blurred. I looked up again, but the shape was gone. The voices, however, grew louder, as if I were unwelcome. My entire body trembled with raw fear. My breathing had turned into a ragged pant, and my shirt clung to my sweaty back. The sense of intrusion became unbearable. Before I fully realized it, I was backing away, stumbling down the hall and out the door, my heart pounding like it might burst. Outside, the air tasted fresher, though it was laced with the iron tang of my own fear. I staggered off the porch, nearly twisting an ankle in my haste. That was when I saw them one last time, the couple in the yard, standing as though they'd stepped through the walls. Their blurry forms drifted toward me, not walking so much as hovering. My mouth went bone dry. I couldn't speak. My voice refused to cooperate. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then with another blink, they were gone. replaced by two elongated shadows that stretched across the grass, creeping toward my feet. It felt like the house itself was breathing. Instinct took over, and I ran. My lungs burned, and each gasp of air scraped my throat. I sprinted until I reached the main road, the dirt turning to asphalt beneath me. Only then did I collapse against a nearby fence, clutching at my chest as I tried to calm the frantic beating of my heart. It took several minutes before I could control my breathing enough to stand upright again. When I looked back, the red chalet seemed distant, bathed in the dim violet of evening. Yet I could still feel it, an unmistakable pull, or perhaps a new understanding. Something existed there, trapped in a boundary between worlds. The couple was bound to that veranda, reappearing time and again as echoes from another dimension. I haven't returned since that night, but even in the safety of my own home, I remain uneasy. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see shapes moving near my windows, or I catch a fleeting reflection in a mirror of two blurred figures behind me. My heart jolts, and I spin around only to find empty air. My nights are filled with unsettled dreams. I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced that I can hear those faint voices in the hallway. Rationally, I know I should put all this behind me, but part of me can't shake the idea that whatever resides in that chalet may have followed me, or at least marked me. The memory of those silhouettes on the wall, persisting after their owners disappeared, gnaws at my sanity. I can't offer a neat conclusion. There was no ultimate confrontation, no heroic banishment of ghosts or unraveling of mysteries. I only know that the chalet is still there, standing silent on that dirt road, holding within its rotting walls a tear in reality, or perhaps a time loop for those unfortunate souls who once lived there. I feel both relieved and horrified that I escaped, if one can even call it an escape. Because at night, in the split second before waking from a nightmare, I swear I can feel myself on that veranda again, hearing those voices swirl around me, seeing those shadows twist across the walls. And in that moment, I realize I am never truly free. The chalet remains waiting, and I sense its presence just beneath the veil of the ordinary world. All I can do is avoid that road, pray those specters stay confined to their hidden dimension, and hope the day never comes when the boundary between us thins once more. The night air felt like a damp cloth pressed against my face, heavy and suffocating. My heart was pounding from the moment I sat up in bed, ears straining to catch the faintest sound. Even before my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I sensed it. That unnatural stillness blanketing the house, a silence so palpable it threatened to crush every inch of my resolve. And beneath that hush, something else lurked, a subtle, elusive presence that felt alive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. That was when I first noticed my bedroom door, securely latched just moments before, now gaping open. A single step into the hallway drove a sharp chill up my spine, and my pulse quickened with the certainty that I was not alone. I live in a single-story home, modest in its layout, a small living room, a cramped kitchen, a short corridor leading to the bedroom and the bathroom, and a spare room I use mostly for storage. It's an older structure, maybe built in the 1950s, full of subtle creaks and groans, typical of a house its age. But these sounds had never bothered me before. They were the pleasant hum of a place settling into the earth, or so I thought. Lately, though, the normal shifting of wood and metal has twisted into something far more sinister. Almost every night, sometime between midnight and the first light of dawn, I hear the internal doors in my house give that soft squeal of hinges, followed by a faint click. When I get up to investigate, I find them all flung wide open, as if an unseen guest has just stepped through each doorway. I tried rational explanations first. I assumed maybe a draft was passing through gaps under the doors, so I taped the frames to seal any air leaks, but the doors still opened. Then I suspected warped wood or old hinges. I replaced the hinges, installed new latches, and even jammed the doors with chairs at times. Still, I would wake to discover them unlatched and open, the chairs pushed aside by a force I couldn't see. The only piece of evidence that something truly unnatural might be at play arrived on a clammy, moonless night when I heard that soft scraping of a chair's legs sliding across the floor. Rushing into the hallway, I found the chair I had wedged under the handle pushed at an odd angle, half-tipped but somehow balanced in place. There were wet footprints leading from the entryway all the way to the living room, footprints so vividly outlined in moisture they glistened under the overhead light. Yet the rest of the floor was dry. I remember standing there, eyes glued to those tracks, breath shaky, tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The footprints were roughly the size of mine, but not exactly. The shape appeared elongated, with toes that seemed almost too long, splayed unnaturally as if adapted for gripping or crawling. When I reached out to touch the water, my fingers came away icy cold. I searched the house for leaks or any sign of dripping from the ceiling. Nothing, not even a damp patch on the walls. The wet footprints ended abruptly in front of the spare room. Past that point, no trace remained. I tried not to panic. I had always considered myself a practical person. Science and reason governed my day-to-day life. I reminded myself over and over that a simple explanation had to exist, and I would find it. Perhaps it was an intruder. The notion made me uneasy, but seemed more plausible than some ghostly visitor. That morning, I placed new locks on every door in the house. Deadbolts, latches, every measure of security I could think of. Even the interior doors got new hardware. I waited until the evening, tested each lock repeatedly, forced them to stay shut. Then I pushed heavy furniture in front of every doorway. It felt paranoid, but I couldn't sleep without taking that extra step. Around midnight, I lay awake, straining to hear any odd sound. The house was suffocatingly still. It was a silence that made my ears ring, as though my mind was trying to fill the absence of noise with a droning static. Sometime in the middle of that tense vigil, I heard it, the unmistakable groan of a wooden door forcibly opening. My heart jolted into my throat. For a moment I felt paralyzed, pinned to the mattress by sheer fear. My breathing grew shallow, my palms grew slick with cold sweat, and my mouth felt as dry as old paper. I could barely hold the flashlight in my trembling hand. I forced myself to investigate. Pushing back the covers, each movement felt like an act of defiance against an invisible occupant. Step by step, I made my way out of the bedroom, the flashlight's beam dancing across the narrow hallway. My mind was racing with countless questions. Was I truly locked inside this terror alone? Was something toying with me, deliberately testing my reactions? Or was my sanity collapsing under the weight of my own paranoia? The corridor light switch did nothing. It was an exposed bulb in the hallway, usually dim but serviceable. Now it flicked and flickered, failing to fully ignite. A faint glimmer pulsed overhead in that sickening off-yellow hue, casting warped shadows along the walls. My heart hammered in my ears as I saw that every piece of furniture I had so painstakingly arranged was moved. Some just a few inches out of place, others halfway across the room. Doors I had locked and blocked stood wide open, hinges squeaking like mocking laughter. A cold breeze circulated through the corridor, yet all the windows were shut tight. My gut twisted in confusion and dread. I recall stepping into the spare room, feeling that swirl of cold air intensify. It was dark, the overhead fixture having burned out months ago. The window drapes were drawn too, sealing in a pitch-black gloom. As my flashlight beam swept across the dusty floor, I noticed something. Half-moon marks in the dust, like the shape of fingertips or small ridges that might be left by an animal's paw. They were scattered around the baseboards, as if whatever had come inside was crawling or dragging itself around the perimeter of the room. The sight sent shudders through my chest, and I started to feel lightheaded. My stomach rolled with a nauseating wave of pure terror. When the electrician came by the next day, at my request, though I tried to keep my voice from trembling over the phone, I explained I was having power fluctuations. I avoided telling him everything, just let him check for wiring issues. He mentioned that the old fuse box was intact, and most circuits looked fine except for a small section near the corridor that showed signs of unusual surges, like there was an intermittent drain on the system. He offered to replace some wiring and left by late afternoon. I recall he asked if I was feeling okay because I kept looking over my shoulder as though someone were standing behind me. I told him I was just tired. That night, the same cycle repeated. Doors flung wide open, locks unlatched. I heard the scraping of wood, the rattling of doorknobs. Each noise pinched my nerves until my body vibrated with an almost painful tension. My bedroom door would groan, open a crack, then I'd slam it shut and lock it, only for it to be found open again hours later. Sleep became impossible. Every sound jolted me upright. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator startled me into a panic. I developed a throbbing headache from lack of rest, and my nerves felt stretched to a breaking point. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I was walking in my sleep. Perhaps I was the one unlocking everything, meticulously placing those wet footprints without realizing it. But then, I remembered the size and shape of those footprints. No human foot looked like that. Still, the alternative explanation was horrifying. Some presence roamed my home under cover of darkness, unstoppable and unseen. I became obsessed with capturing proof of these events. I set up an old camera on a tripod in the hallway, aimed at the living room entrance. I didn't have a proper night vision camera, so I attached a makeshift flashlight to ensure some illumination. I also laid towels across the floor, hoping to see them disturbed if anything or anyone walked there. My plan was to stay up all night, watch the feed in real time, and record anything that moved. For hours, nothing happened. I sat hunched in my chair, eyes glued to the small monitor. The monotony of waiting lulled me into a restless doze, though I fought it tooth and nail. My eyelids grew unbearably heavy, and the steady whir of the camera's internal motor sang a lullaby of mechanical hums. Eventually, I succumbed, maybe just for a minute or two, but it was enough. When I jolted awake, I froze at the sight of my own face reflected in the darkened monitor. The camera feed had cut out. My chest tightened in a rush of panic. Scrambling to my feet, I hurried to the camera. The power switch was still on, but the flashlight I'd attached had gone out. The towels on the floor were strewn about as if someone had kicked them in frustration. Fear coursed through me, a pounding in my ears that left me almost deaf. I could feel cold sweat breaking across my forehead, and my legs wobbled. My breath came in short, painful gasps. I tried to adjust the camera, but it was as if something had drained the battery entirely. When I turned around, the door to the spare room was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it tight before. I approached carefully, heart hammering so loud in my chest I could barely think. Inside the spare room, the air felt thicker, heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy that prickled along my arms. Shining a flashlight around, I saw the entire space had been rearranged. Boxes stacked in one corner were now toppled, their contents spilling across the floor. An old mirror propped against the wall lay shattered, shards reflecting my shaking flashlight beam. And near the far corner, I glimpsed something I can only describe as a faint shimmer, like heat haze rising from asphalt on a scorching day, but twisted into a vaguely humanoid outline. It flickered and disappeared almost instantly, leaving my heart slamming against my ribs. For a split second, I doubted my sanity more than ever. I told myself I must have been imagining it. Maybe the reflection from my flashlight had danced strangely on the shattered glass. Yet deep in my gut, I knew I saw something. I felt its presence in the marrow of my bones, an ancient kind of dread that I couldn't rationalize away. That marked a turning point. My fear escalated from anxiety to full-blown paranoia. I began triple-checking every door, testing every lock at least a dozen times before bed. I even took to sleeping with the hallway light on, not that it mattered. Some nights, the corridor bulb would blink out on its own, plunging me into a darkness so thick I could taste it. Other times, an overwhelming sense of being watched would jolt me awake, leaving me drenched in sweat, heart galloping, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Friends from work asked me why I was so jumpy. I dodged their questions. When they insisted, I offered vague explanations about insomnia and stress. One coworker recommended I see a therapist, and I nodded politely. Inside, I was torn between wanting professional help and worrying a doctor would label me delusional. The problem was that everything felt too real. I still felt the doorknobs twist in the middle of the night, heard the distinct rattling of brass against wood, sensed the presence pacing my halls, testing each door as though waiting for me to come out. Unable to cope any longer, I planned one final stand. I would confront whatever haunted my home. I spent a week preparing. I performed internet searches on cleansing rituals, smudging with sage, filling bowls with salt to place at thresholds. I read about warding symbols, though I didn't have any deep belief in them. Still, in my desperation, I was willing to try anything, no matter how superstitious it seemed. I draped the windows with new curtains, hoping to barricade out the unknown. Every night I lit candles and walked through each room, reciting mantras I'd memorized. I can't say I believed these rites would truly work, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a feeling that at least I was fighting back. The first few nights of this ritual, the activity seemed to diminish. The doors stayed closed, though the locks felt loose, as if turned from the other side. The tension in the air remained, but it was subdued, like a caged animal biding its time. I allowed myself a glimmer of hope, tried to get some actual rest. I should have known better. The final night of my makeshift cleansing, I woke to the unmistakable squeal of hinges so loud it pierced the silence like a knife. My bedroom door flew open with a violent force that sent it banging against the wall. My eyes snapped open, my entire body seized with terror. I sat up, flashlight in hand, sweat trickling down my temples. The hallway was bathed in a sickly glow from the lamp I'd left on. My stomach twisted into knots as I noticed an impossibility. Footprints of water, large and strangely shaped, leading from the center of the living room to the threshold of my bedroom. Each step glimmered in the lamp's pallid light, shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. I felt a strangled noise escape my throat, something between a gasp and a cry. Standing at the threshold, I finally witnessed a shape. It was that same faint shimmer I had glimpsed in the spare room, only this time the outline was clearer. Though transparent, it held a vaguely human silhouette, tall and unnervingly distorted, as though every joint was bent at an unnatural angle. For a single heartbeat, it stood motionless, and I was paralyzed by the sheer alien presence of it. My breath was shallow, and my limbs trembled uncontrollably, a cold sweat soaking my shirt. Every hair on my body stood erect in primal terror. Then, without warning, the shape moved. Not forward, not backward, but it sort of pulsed, flickering out of sight, only to reappear a foot closer. My heart pounded harder than I ever thought possible, my vision blurring at the edges. I managed to shine the flashlight directly at it. That was when it recoiled, letting out a hiss that I felt more than heard, like a crackling static reverberating inside my skull. Acting on instinct, I stumbled backward, nearly falling onto my bed. Gathering the last shred of my courage, I forced myself to move. With each step, my legs threatened to collapse from the quaking fear surging through them. But I retreated into the hallway, forcing the flashlight's beam onto the entity, ignoring the dryness in my throat and the throb of my pulse. Each heartbeat felt like a drumbeat inside my ears. The shape reared back, then shot away, disappearing around the corner toward the spare room. I heard a frantic rattling, a door slamming, then absolute silence. I stood there panting, mind teetering on the edge. Finally, adrenaline gave way to exhaustion, and I realized this was my chance. If that thing was retreating, I needed to leave. I had to abandon the house, at least for a while, no matter how irrational it sounded. So, I grabbed the essentials, a bag I'd packed days before, car keys in a trembling hand, and darted outside. My lungs gulped the cool night air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt that crushing oppression lift, replaced by open emptiness. I drove until I reached a motel on the outskirts of town, where the neon lights hummed and flickered. My nerves were still frayed, my hands shaking as I checked into a small room with battered furniture. Lying in that stiff bed, I expected to feel relief. But instead, I was confronted by an unsettling realization. The presence was not necessarily confined to my house. It felt attached to me, or to some intangible link between us. Even as I drifted off, haunted by images of watery footprints and that shimmering silhouette, I sensed I hadn't truly escaped. To this day, I haven't gone back to the house for more than a few hours at a time, always in the daylight. I check the mailbox, make sure no stray animals have broken in. Everything looks eerily undisturbed on the surface. Furniture in place, floors dry, doors closed. But the tension lingers, thick in every room, whispering that nothing has really changed. Standing in the living room, I feel the same invisible gaze tracking my every move. It's as if the walls themselves have eyes. I lock up and hurry out, my heart pounding until I'm safely on the road, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. I don't know if I'll ever feel at peace again. The open doors, the footprints, the distorted shape, these memories cling to me like shadows, creeping into my mind whenever night falls. Part of me dreads the day I decide to confront whatever is there again, but another part insists that I must, eventually. Because this thing, whatever it is, has already made a home in my fear, in my thoughts, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night in the motel, I still hear the slow creak of a door pushing open, beckoning me back into that darkness. From the moment I first stepped into that cramped apartment, I felt a cold wave of discomfort wash over me. It was as though the air itself had decided to protest our presence, resisting each breath I took. The hallway leading to our door was narrow and perpetually shadowy, lit by a single flickering bulb that seemed on the verge of burning out at any second. The faint hum of electricity made my skin prickle, and the stale scent of dust and faint mildew clung to every inch of the space. My roommate, let's call him Miguel, was already setting down boxes in the living area, but I barely noticed. My attention was locked on an odd, almost imperceptible draft that moved through the apartment, as if it had a mind of its own. It felt like the place was breathing, expelling air in ragged bursts, letting me know it was alive in ways an apartment shouldn't be. I was a college student back then, full of anxious excitement to finally live independently, or at least as independently as a tiny two-room apartment shared with another person would allow. The building itself was decades old, possibly older, with creaking wooden floors that popped unexpectedly underfoot. Every sound in that place felt personal, like footsteps echoing through the night, though we had no upstairs neighbors. My heart would sometimes pound just hearing the walls shift, generating subtle creaks that would send my imagination spiraling. In the beginning, I tried to write it off as typical old building charm. But deep down, something about the apartment nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it held a secret, something it didn't want to reveal yet. During the first week, small occurrences began piling up. At night, when the wind would blow against our street-facing window, it was normal to hear a slight rattle. But there were moments, far too many, when there was no wind at all. Yet the window would vibrate so forcefully that I'd wake up drenched in cold sweat, heart hammering against my ribcage. My breath would catch in my throat as I stared at the moonlit glass, half convinced it might shatter if it shook any harder. Each time I stepped closer, the rattling abruptly stopped. It left me uncertain whether the sound had been real or a half-dream conjured by my own anxiety. Although I tried ignoring those incidents, more oddities soon followed. Small objects began to disappear, only to reappear in places that made no sense. My keys turned up in the bathroom sink, my phone in the small broom closet by the kitchen. Miguel grumbled now and then that he was sure he'd put his textbooks on the desk, yet found them stacked behind the living room couch. We never saw these objects move, never caught them in midair. It was as though they slipped through space whenever we glanced away. Each time I felt a jolt of unease course through my veins, like ice sliding under my skin. My rational mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Stress, forgetfulness, Or maybe we were simply unorganized. But that justification rang hollow, especially when I noticed heavier objects, like a lamp, moved from the corner table to the center of the living room floor. A quiet voice inside me whispered that these incidents were not normal at all. The nightly disturbances soon escalated. Our tiny kitchen was separated from the living room by a flimsy folding door that screeched if you opened it too quickly. One evening, while I was alone, I sat at our beat-up dining table trying to focus on some coursework. The overhead light flickered in slow pulses, emphasizing my growing headache, and the occasional car horn outside only sharpened my nerves. Suddenly, I heard a crashing noise in the living room. My muscles tensed, and an instant wave of adrenaline flooded my body. My throat went dry as I rose to investigate. The living room lamp was lying on the floor, the bulb rolling in a slow spiral around the base. There was no sign of forced entry, no sense that an intruder had rummaged through our belongings. The window was locked, and the door's chain was secured. I could barely swallow as my heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Something unseen had knocked that lamp over, and I couldn't think of a single rational excuse for it. I remember how the nights got worse from that point. Multiple times I woke up to the sensation of my mattress shifting slightly, as if someone had just sat down beside me. More than once I bolted upright in bed, sweat trickling down my neck, certain that a presence lingered in the darkness, watching me breathe. The suffocating feeling of being observed made my skin crawl, and sometimes I swore I heard faint whisper-like sounds, as if someone were standing inches from my ear. But whenever I turned on the lamp, the room was empty, an uninviting hush closing in around me. Miguel started to mention that he too felt something was off. He told me, in a tense, low tone, that he believed there might be an unseen tenant sharing the apartment with us. He rarely spoke of it directly because the topic made him uneasy, but I could tell that his usually calm exterior was splintering. On one occasion, he had come to me looking pale, as if he hadn't slept in days, and said he heard the sound of his door opening in the middle of the night, followed by heavy breathing right behind his bed. It took him over an hour to gather the courage to switch on his bedside lamp. My own anxiety spiked each time he recounted his experiences, fueling my suspicion that we were dealing with something neither of us truly understood. Eventually, I began to lose my grip on what was real. I caught myself second-guessing mundane events. A slight change in the air pressure, a door hinge squeak, even the way the refrigerator hummed. Every noise felt like a threat. Every shadow in the hallway taunted me. My skin would break out in goosebumps whenever I caught a glimpse of a dark corner, convinced something might be lurking just outside my field of vision. My mouth stayed perpetually dry from the tension, and my shoulders ached from being in a constant state of alert. At times, I couldn't concentrate on my classes at all. My mind drifted to that stifling apartment, replaying each unsettling moment in a loop I couldn't turn off. One night was particularly unforgettable. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the old windows as if possessed by a fury that demanded entry. I remember the sweat collecting at the small of my back while I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with some reading. Miguel had gone out to buy groceries, leaving me alone. Suddenly, the living room window began to vibrate so violently that the curtains flew inward, tangling themselves in a frantic dance. My heart lurched, and a jolt of adrenaline surged up my spine, making my breath hitch in my throat. I scrambled to grab the edges of the curtain, but the gust that swept into the apartment felt unnatural, cold in a way that seemed to cling to my skin, not just passing over it. My teeth nearly chattered from the drop in temperature, despite it being a reasonably mild evening. Then, as abruptly as it started, the wind died down. The rattling ceased, and all I could hear was the rapid drum of my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned on every light I could find, trembling in place, trying to collect myself. That's when I noticed, on the wall near the window, a handprint smeared in dark grime. It looked like soot or black dust, complete with the imprint of each finger. The sight made my skin prickle. I felt my breath catch in a series of uneven gasps. The shape was far too large to be my own hand, and it did not match Miguel's either. My knees felt weak as I stepped closer, trying in vain to rationalize how it got there. I reached out and my hand shook so badly I almost couldn't keep it still. The soot felt slightly moist, even though it looked like old ash. A wave of nausea twisted through my stomach, and I immediately withdrew. I recognized that same draft creeping under my clothes again, making me shiver. There was nobody else in the apartment that night. I was entirely sure of that. So how did a phantom hand manage to brand itself onto our wall? By the time Miguel returned, I was still standing there, staring at the print. I barely registered that he asked if I had turned on all the lights. He used a hushed, anxious tone after seeing the handprint. I watched him run to the bathroom to scrub his hands, as if he could wash away the guilt of our situation. Deep down, both of us knew it wasn't something normal. It was something hostile, feeding on our terror and doubt, growing bolder the more it toyed with our minds. I felt cornered in my own home, burdened by the thick weight of dread that settled into every fiber of my being. At that point, I tried anything to banish the pervasive darkness. I quietly prayed before bed, mumbling entreaties I barely remembered from childhood. I left lamps on around the apartment, hoping the light would drive away the shadows. Miguel and I would keep the television running all night at a low volume, anything to mask the uncomfortable silence. Yet the disturbances continued. It was as if the entity, or whatever it was, knew exactly how to exploit our fears. Our nerves were so frayed that each new incident felt like a dagger to our collective sanity. Every muscle in my body would tighten at the slightest hint of movement. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my head pounded constantly. I worried that I might collapse one day from exhaustion. The more exhausted I grew, the more I felt my perception warping. Sometimes, in the corners of my vision, I thought I saw a shape flicker, a tall, hunched silhouette that vanished when I turned my head. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked drawn and pale, with dark circles under my eyes that made me look sick. I started to mistrust my own recollections, especially if Miguel wasn't around to confirm them. I tried to brush off a persistent notion that the walls were closing in on me, but the claustrophobic feeling was overwhelming. Each corner of the apartment felt pregnant with menace, as if the entire space had become a trap set for my sanity. Late one evening, I experienced the most intense episode of terror I'd had thus far. The overhead lights flickered, and a piercing sound like nails on a chalkboard tore through the corridor connecting my bedroom to the living room. My heart rate skyrocketed, and I broke out in a cold sweat. Every sense was on high alert, my breathing so rapid I felt lightheaded. The door to my bedroom slammed shut of its own accord, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Fear coursed through my veins like fire, leaving my limbs trembling uncontrollably. For a brief moment I froze in place, convinced that if I opened that door, I would see something crouched on the other side, waiting for me. It took what felt like an eternity to summon the courage to turn the handle. By the time I did, the living room was still again, washed in that stale, artificial glow that seemed powerless against the gloom seeping in from the corners. That was the final push Miguel and I needed. We could no longer pretend that things might improve, or that we could endure the mounting anxiety. The apartment was devouring our peace of mind, draining us physically and mentally. So we made the decision to move out, determined to leave everything behind rather than continue living in a place that felt palpably malevolent. Gathering our belongings was a frantic process. At every step, I glanced over my shoulder, certain I would see that soot-stained hand or a creeping shadow beckoning me from across the room. My breath came in short gasps, adrenaline pulsing in my veins, as we loaded box after box into our car. The hallway outside felt no safer, its dim light swinging overhead. Yet it was still better than being trapped inside with whatever force had claimed our living space. On the last night, I slept in my clothes, too tense to change. I kept every lamp on, though it didn't stop the unnatural chills from raising the hairs on the back of my neck. Sleep finally took me, but it was restless, full of half-formed nightmares and unknown figures whispering in the darkness. In the early hours of the morning, I jolted awake. For a second, I imagined I heard a rasping breath just inches from my ear, but it might have been my own frantic inhalation. My pulse hammered, and my chest felt constricted, as though I was drawing breath through a straw. I clung to the last shred of courage I had left and waited for the sun to rise. We carried out the final boxes at dawn. The sight of daylight helped soothe my nerves, yet I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that the apartment was watching us leave. It was as if something had pressed its presence against the windows, tracking our every move, waiting for a chance to lash out again. My heart thudded heavily as I locked the door for the last time. The corridor smelled stale, the same faint mildew mingled with unclean air. It felt like a sad, hollow place, but the sense of release I felt upon stepping outside was immense. We'd made it out. We hadn't banished the darkness, but we chose to deny it any further power over us. To this day, I can't say for certain what haunted that tiny apartment. It could have been a malignant entity feeding off fear, or perhaps my imagination twisted normal creaks and groans into a waking nightmare. Yet even now, years later, a part of me is convinced that place was alive in a terrible, hungry way. The memory still sends chills crawling across my skin when I think of that sooty handprint on the wall, or recall the echo of disembodied footsteps in the dark. I'll never fully erase the sensation of being observed, nor the tense ache that lived in my shoulders while dwelling there. I sometimes wake from dreams where I'm back in that suffocating space. In those dreams, I'm struggling to switch on the lights, but the bulbs are always flickering or going out, and I can't see what lurks just beyond the doorway. My mouth goes dry, and my heart hammers so loud it drowns out everything else. When I finally open my eyes to my current surroundings, relief floods me, but a disquieting sense of leftover dread lingers, reminding me of what once happened. It's a persistent, unsettling legacy of that ominous apartment, a warning that some places are simply wrong, as though they exist to devour the spirits of those who dare enter. And whether it was truly supernatural or just the manifestation of our deepest fears, that place changed me. No matter how much time has passed, I cannot forget those nights spent in the oppressive darkness, chased by an unseen watcher. I escaped, but I still carry the memory of its cold, lingering breath on the back of my neck. I arrived at my uncle's property on a night so still that every step I took seemed to echo against the walls of the silent countryside. The clouds smothered the moonlight, leaving only the faint glow of a single porch lamp, flickering like a dying heartbeat. My first thought was that I should have turned around and gone home, but I had promised my uncle I would watch over his place, so I brushed off that unsettling sense of foreboding. That was my first mistake, dismissing my instincts. I'm not a superstitious man. I've always taken pride in my level-headedness. Yet, from the moment I set foot on the grounds, an oppressive hush weighed on my shoulders. The air felt stagnant and cold, as though the very atmosphere was reluctant to let me breathe. I tried to chalk it up to nerves. After all, it was late, and the property sat miles away from the nearest town. Still, the uneasy feeling clung to me, making the hair on my arms prickle. On my first night, I walked through each room of the small house to get familiar with it. The living room had large windows overlooking a patio, and beyond that lay a patch of wild grass leading to a cluster of trees. Beyond the trees stretched empty acreage. The house itself was unremarkable: worn rugs, rustic wooden furniture, and a massive fireplace built of dark stones. But something about that fireplace drew my attention right away, as if it was quietly beckoning me. The drive to the property had been lengthy and draining, so I decided to head to bed early. Before turning in, I made sure every door and window was locked. I switched off the living room light and tried not to pay attention to the echo in the chimney that seemed to breathe in the darkness. It sounded like a faint draft, but it raised goosebumps along my neck. I forced myself upstairs, reminding myself there was nothing to fear. Later that night, I awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone laughing, a low, raspy chuckle, drifting through the stillness just outside my window. My heart nearly stopped. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was a vagrant passing by or an animal that made an odd noise. Holding my breath, I glanced at the clock. 2:49 a.m. The laughter faded quickly, as though smothered by the oppressive night air. I waited, Every muscle in my body tensed, but I heard nothing else. It was just me, alone in that dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my terror, and I drifted back to an uneasy sleep. The next morning brought a feeble comfort. Sunlight seeped through the curtains, and the house felt less intimidating. I tried to reassure myself that the laughter had been a dream. I walked downstairs into the living room and approached the large fireplace, a curdling dread curling in my stomach. Something about that space was off. It took me a moment to see it. Ashes in the fireplace had formed what looked like crude symbols. Geometric shapes and something resembling spirals dotted the blackened stone. My chest tightened. It was as if some cryptic message had been burned into the hearth. The odd part was, the ashes looked fresh. I told myself that perhaps my uncle had started a fire before leaving, and it was nothing but coincidental patterns in the soot. Nonetheless, it unsettled me enough that I grabbed a metal brush to clear out the ashes. The instant I touched them, a barely perceptible hiss reached my ears, almost like a voice murmuring, "Don't do that." My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Adrenaline shot through my veins, my heart hammering so violently, I wondered if it might burst. For several moments, I stood there, struggling to keep my composure. Then I forced myself to push through the fear and scrape the ashes away. I refused to let my imagination gain the upper hand. That same afternoon, I walked around the property to ensure there really wasn't anyone lurking in the vicinity. The rustic fence at the perimeter had a few gaps, but nothing large enough for a person to slip through easily. The gate was locked, no signs of forced entry. The yard was quiet, the grass so tall that a gentle breeze made it sway like ocean waves. Standing outside under the muted sun, I couldn't help but sense I was being watched. I turned around more than once, expecting to see a face pressed against the windows or a shape darting behind the trees. But I found only emptiness and silence. I spent the rest of the day tidying the house and trying to focus on other tasks. A few times, the electricity flickered. The overhead lights would dim, then surge. Once, the kitchen light bulb popped, plunging the room into darkness. The sound made me jump so badly that I dropped a glass on the floor. My heart still pounded from the strange occurrences of the day, and now I had the added hassle of cleaning up broken shards. By evening, I had lost all appetite. When dusk settled, the property took on a more sinister quality. The trees, once serene, now cast elongated shadows that stretched across the yard like bony fingers. I had closed all the curtains and turned on every light to dispel the gloom, but the electrical fluctuations made the illumination unreliable. The lamps glowed feebly, sometimes flickering at the edges of my vision. It felt like living inside a failing lighthouse, each flicker threatening to plunge me into darkness. That night, I tried to occupy my mind by watching old television reruns. The static made it barely watchable, but it was better than the silence that pressed against the windows. Around midnight, the power cut off for about 30 seconds. My lungs seized as I sat in a blind, suffocating void. I was certain I heard movement just outside the living room window. The shuffle of feet, maybe. Then the lights came back on, and the television buzzed to life with a crackling sound that nearly caused me to bolt off the couch. I spent the next hour with my heart beating double time, too afraid to move. On the third day, I checked the fireplace again. The ashes I had removed were back. Not in the same arrangement as before, but spread in new, equally bizarre shapes. I could feel a chill emanating from the hearth, as though a draft of wintry air seeped from some hidden chamber. My hands trembled, and sweat collected at my temples. The tension in my gut made me nauseous. I told myself my uncle must have left some flue open, letting ashes blow around. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that there was something else at play. Something not of this world, or at least not of any logic I recognized. I was desperate for some reassurance. I used my cell phone to call a friend back in town, describe the strange noises and the laughter. She suggested it could be the wind, or animals outside, or maybe even a trick of my own tired mind. Her calm voice offered me a sliver of solace, but it didn't silence the dread that gnawed at me. After we hung up, the house felt emptier than ever. as though it resented me for seeking help. By evening, the anxiety had become physically draining. My palms were perpetually clammy, and every sound jolted me like an electric shock. Around twilight, I decided I needed a distraction. I grabbed a broom to sweep the patio, telling myself that manual labor might clear my mind. Outside, the sky was bruised purple and gray, and a cold wind rattled the trees. As I swept, I caught a glimpse of something moving by the fence, a fleeting shape dark against the backdrop of the field. My heart rate surged. I clutched the broom like a weapon, stepping forward to see if I could spot it again. But there was nothing, just the rustling grass. I hurried inside and slammed the door. My breathing was ragged, and I felt my pulse throbbing at my temples. The laughter did not return that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I paced the living room, occasionally glancing at the fireplace. Every time I passed it, I felt a tingling chill crawl up my spine, as though something stirred there, an entity that watched me with invisible eyes. With each pass, the chill intensified until I could barely bring myself to approach that end of the room. The house seemed to sense my fear, and it fed on it, making the air taste stale and metallic. Later, the electricity began to flicker once more. Light bulbs dimmed, then surged, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. My breath became shallow, a cold sweat clinging to my neck. The oppressive hush of the property settled over everything, and my thoughts began to race. I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. My logic told me none of this was possible, that there must be a rational explanation. A faulty electrical system, a draft in the chimney, a figment of my imagination. Yet every sensation in my body screamed that something malevolent resided here, feeding on my dread. I resolved to leave the next morning. I reasoned that I would call my uncle, explain the power issues, and tell him I couldn't stay any longer. No job was worth this kind of terror. Unfortunately, the night had other plans. Around 3 a.m, the sound of scraping against the walls downstairs startled me out of a shallow sleep. My heart pounded so loud it felt like the thunder of war drums in my ears. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, forcing myself to investigate. Reaching the living room, I shone the light across the walls. There, near the fireplace, I saw faint scratch marks, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the stone. I felt my stomach lurch, and my throat constricted. The electricity was out again, leaving the room bathed in shadows. I couldn't bring myself to step closer. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my grip. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. Then came a new sound, a raspy hush, like a distant whisper. It pressed against my eardrums. My instinct was to run, but my body refused to move. Fear pinned me in place, as though the house itself wanted me to witness whatever lurked there. The chill emanating from the fireplace grew sharp, slicing through the humidity in the room. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Suddenly, the flashlight blinked off, plunging me into absolute darkness. My pulse thundered. I expected to hear that mocking laugh again, or the hiss that told me to stop what I was doing. But this time, it was a deep guttural rasp that seemed to scrape the inside of my skull. In that blind moment, I could almost see the shape of a presence in my mind's eye, twisted and formless, all-consuming. For an agonizing few seconds, the air felt thick, too heavy to draw in. My lungs screamed. Then with a spark and a hum, the power returned. My flashlight flickered back to life. The living room lights glowed weakly overhead, revealing only my own reflection in the windows. My hands were shaking so badly that the beam of light danced across the walls in erratic patterns. The scratch marks on the stone looked deeper now, as though fresh cuts had been added while the lights were out. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to abandon the house right then and there. I ran upstairs, threw my clothes into a backpack, and nearly tripped down the steps in my haste to reach the front door. As I approached the fireplace one last time, I heard that faint hiss again, a sibilant warning that coiled around my ears. It felt like a final attempt to keep me from leaving. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the trees at unnatural angles. The sky churned with thick clouds, I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, sweat streaming down my face. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my hands trembled so violently it took me 3 tries to insert the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I breathed a shaky sigh of relief and pressed the accelerator, leaving the property behind me. However, the escape provided no real comfort. Even with the headlights illuminating the road ahead, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half convinced I would see a shapeless entity hunched in the back seat. My mind played tricks on me, conjuring fleeting silhouettes at the edges of my vision. Every fiber of my being felt on edge, blood rushing so loudly in my ears that I could barely think. My sense of reality had been fractured by that house. When I finally made it back to my own apartment, I locked the door and sat in the darkness, trying to calm my frazzled nerves. The simple act of breathing felt like a challenge. Every time I closed my eyes, I recalled that rasping voice, the sinister symbols in the ashes, and the laughter echoing outside my window. Sleep came in fits, haunted by half-formed nightmares. The next morning, I discovered fresh scratches on my arm. They weren't deep, but they formed the same kind of spirals I'd seen in the fireplace ashes. I had no memory of making them myself, no recollection of any incident that could have left them there. I never told my uncle the true extent of what happened. I simply informed him that the electrical system was failing, and I felt uncomfortable staying there alone. He seemed puzzled, but he didn't press for details. Yet even now, whenever I'm alone in a quiet room, I catch myself checking corners and listening for sounds that don't belong. Late at night, if I happen to hear the faintest chuckle in the distance, my chest tightens in familiar panic. Something took root in me during those nights at the chakra. It gnaws at my peace of mind, a constant reminder that certain places and certain presences exist beyond our comfortable notions of reality. I'm still not sure what I encountered, whether it was a spirit, a manifestation of fear, or something far more ancient and inexplicable. I can't say. But I know this. Once you feel that chill crawling over your skin and sense that stare lingering on you when no one is around, life is never quite the same again. I escaped that property, yet sometimes in the darkness of my own home, I still wonder if I truly left whatever it was behind, or if it followed me, clinging to my shadow and whispering in my nightmares. It all began with an unsettling weight in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. The moment I first set foot inside this old 2-story place, something about the silence twisted the pit of my stomach. It was not the typical hush of a vacant building. It felt charged with a presence I could not name. The corridor lights seemed dimmer than they should, as if an unseen hand was turning the bulbs down a notch. Every shadow stretched itself in unnatural ways. Even my own reflection in the hallway mirror appeared subtly askew. There was an instant impression that I was not alone, that something older, heavier, lingered beneath the floorboards and above the ceilings. It was a sensation I dismissed at first, chalking it up to my own overactive imagination. But from that day forward, the house, particularly the attic, set the stage for nights of dread I still cannot fully explain. I remember the first evening I slept here. The bedroom was chilly, even with the windows sealed. I blamed the autumn wind for that initial draft, but it felt far too cold for a mild night. My breath caught in my throat whenever I inhaled, forcing me to exhale in short, cautious puffs. The hallway's overhead light flickered every so often, giving me the uncomfortable feeling that something lurked just beyond the circle of illumination. The house shifted and groaned in the dark, as old structures do, but there was a particular set of thumping noises I couldn't ignore. They came from above, heavy footsteps, methodical and slow. I tried to reassure myself that I was imagining things, or perhaps I was picking up echoes from a neighbor's house, but the pacing was too distinct, resonating exactly overhead in my attic. Lying in bed, I found myself straining to hear more, to catch the exact pattern, and indeed, it was a slow, deliberate tread that would stop for a few moments, then start up again. It was as though someone, or something, was prowling back and forth with a specific purpose. When morning arrived, I was desperate to convince myself it had been a dream or some trick of acoustics. I decided that day I would check the attic, see if any animals had made a nest. Rational explanations were my lifeline. After locating the retractable ladder's pull cord in the ceiling of the upstairs corridor, I braced myself and tugged. The ladder creaked open like an ancient secret. Dusty wooden rungs extended, and a stale odor wafted down. Flashlight in hand, I climbed into the gloom. Dim light filtered through a small circular window at one end of the attic, but aside from that, everything was draped in shadow. The air felt thick, clogging my nostrils with the smell of old insulation and centuries-old dust. As I swept the beam of my flashlight across the floorboards, I spotted footprints, a trail of distinct impressions in the dust, leading from the far corner to the center of the space. My heart thudded so hard I could hear its pulse in my ears. Each footprint was larger than my own shoe, and they seemed fresh, the dust clearly disturbed. Yet there were no returning prints, no sign that whoever made them had ever left. They ended abruptly, as if the maker had vanished into thin air right in the middle of the attic. I stood in stunned silence, telling myself it had to be a prank. Maybe some previous tenant or a contractor left those prints before I moved in. But the dryness in my mouth and the sudden cold sweat clinging to my scalp told a different story. I felt watched, like I had intruded upon a private space. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard a soft exhale nearby, just at the edge of my hearing. My arms erupted in goosebumps, and I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered against the far wall, revealing nothing but aged planks and dust motes floating in the stagnant air. Still, the sensation of being observed refused to go away. As quickly as I could manage, I backed toward the opening and placed one foot on the ladder. My heart hammered against my ribs, the thundering so pronounced I wondered if it was audible in the attic's silence. Suddenly, the ladder jerked upward, snapping shut of its own accord. The force nearly broke my fingers, and I stumbled back with a strangled yelp, barely steadying myself before I lost my balance entirely. The hatch door slammed, plunging the attic into darkness. Panic shot through me like a jolt of electricity. I hammered on the hatch, fumbling for the latch mechanism, but it felt jammed. My breathing became frantic, short, rapid gasps that refused to fill my lungs. I don't know how many seconds or minutes passed before the hatch suddenly sprang free, as if released by invisible hands. The ladder clattered down, allowing me to scramble back into the corridor. I collapsed on the floor, legs trembling, mouth dry. It felt as though I had escaped a predator's lair. I tried to regain some composure, leaning against the wall and running a shaky hand through my hair. My heart was still hammering, and my vision swam from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. After a few moments, I forced myself to stand. The corridor seemed darker than before, even though the light was on. An irrational part of me wondered if something had followed me down. I looked up at the hatch. It remained open, but any thought of going back up there made my pulse jump. Deciding enough was enough, I pushed the ladder back into place with deliberate caution, then shut the hatch. I tried to lock it, but there was no real lock, just a simple latch that anyone, or anything on the other side, could push open. After that, a persistent feeling of being watched settled over the house. Each night the footsteps returned. They started as a faint shuffle, then escalated to a thumping stride that made the light fixtures on the ceiling rattle. I spent several sleepless nights sitting up in bed, blankets clutched to my chest, ears straining in the darkness. My shoulders tensed at each heavy step, expecting it to stop right above my bedroom. Sometimes it did, and in those moments of dead silence, I could feel a presence hovering, as though peering down through the ceiling. My dreams, on the nights I did manage to drift off, turned into a twisted echo of the real torment. I dreamed of the attic ladder descending on its own, then glimpses of an unseen figure pacing the floors overhead, featureless, yet somehow radiating a malicious anticipation. The house itself seemed to react. Doors that had once stayed shut now drifted open. Light bulbs burned out faster. The living room, usually the brightest area, took on a shadowy pall even in the daytime. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself the wirings were old, the fixtures needed replacing. But deep down, the gnawing dread told me otherwise. I felt that whatever was in the attic was slowly bleeding into the rest of the house, overshadowing every corner, creeping behind every door. Even the mirrors became suspect. Whenever I caught my reflection, I noticed my eyes were bloodshot from poor sleep. Yet there was an odd flicker in them I didn't recognize, like an intruder behind the glass, studying me from within. In an attempt to regain some sense of control, I reached out for help, though indirectly. A colleague who knew a bit about old houses mentioned that attics sometimes develop pockets of cold air or weird acoustics. But even as I recounted my experiences, I found myself omitting the more unsettling details. I couldn't bring myself to mention the footprints abruptly ending or the ladder snapping shut on its own. I feared sounding unhinged. My colleague suggested maybe I was dealing with pests or rotted wood creating illusions of footsteps. I pretended to agree, but as soon as I got off the phone, the house seemed to exhale, as though it had been waiting for me to let my guard down. A faint, rhythmic pounding started up above. My mouth went dry, and a chill slithered through my arms and settled in my chest. Over time, the sensations grew more intense. I'd feel eyes on me in every room, particularly in the narrow corridor leading to the attic. The atmosphere pressed on me like thick humidity, making every breath laborious. My anxiety soared. I found myself checking behind me constantly. Any subtle noise, pipes clanking, floorboards shifting, ignited a burst of panic. The worst part was the feeling that my sense of reality was slipping. I began to question if the footsteps were real or a figment of my exhausted mind. Yet every time I built up enough skepticism to brush it off as paranoia, a loud thump or a creak above my head would jolt me into a fresh wave of fear. Sleep deprivation started to erode my judgment, and I began to suspect that I was teetering on the edge of some breakdown. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to confront the attic again. I told myself I would not be a prisoner in my own home. I pulled on a thick jacket, switched on every light in the corridor, and mustered enough courage to pull the hatch open. The ladder descended with a groan, almost sounding like a warning. My heart raced, and my palms were slick with sweat, but I forced my feet onto the rungs. The attic swallowed me in darkness as soon as my head cleared the entry. This time, I brought a brighter flashlight and a heavy metal rod, more a psychological security blanket than an actual weapon. I braced myself, shining the light in all directions, determined to find a raccoon, a squirrel, anything that would explain those footsteps. The hush in that space was suffocating. My breath echoed, and my pulse drummed in my ears. I spotted the same footprint trail as before. Now, however, there were more prints, branching out like some cryptic pattern in the dust. My chest tightened with a fear so profound it felt almost physical. The footprints zigzagged and swirled, then ended in that same abrupt manner in the middle of the floor. I followed them, stepping as quietly as I could. At one point, I noticed a cluster of them surrounding a small square of floorboards that appeared slightly raised. I crouched down, shining my flashlight. An odd sense of static electricity pricked my skin. My breath caught in my throat. I had the most bizarre sensation that if I touched that raised plank, I'd unleash something I couldn't control. My body shook with the dread of an inexplicable presence so close. That was when I heard it. A raspy intake of breath, very near my ear. Every hair on my neck bristled. I spun around, rod raised, the beam of my flashlight slicing the darkness. There was no one, yet I felt it, felt an oppressive mass in the darkness. My vision wavered with raw panic and I stumbled back, my footsteps scattering dust in every direction. The next sound was a sharp click, like a trigger being pulled. Before I could move, the ladder jerked upward again. In a split second, I flung myself toward the opening, jamming the rod into the gap. The ladder slammed but caught on the rod. I crawled forward, heart racing, and pried the hatch open just wide enough to clamber through. The corridor light felt like a spotlight compared to that suffocating attic. My limbs shook so badly I could barely stand once I hit the hallway floor. I slammed the hatch shut with my shoulder and braced against it, as though expecting whatever lurked above to force its way out. Nothing happened for a moment, but then the attic was alive with banging, heavy, furious thuds on the inside of the hatch. Each impact reverberated through the ceiling, rattling my teeth. My chest constricted, and I was convinced I would pass out. I held the hatch latch with all my strength, but the pounding suddenly stopped, leaving me in a trembling silence broken only by my ragged breathing. Eventually, the corridor light flickered and stabilized, and the hush returned, more terrifying than the noise. It felt like the entire house was listening, aware of my every thought. That night, I could not bear to stay. I hurriedly packed a bag, dashing from room to room, always feeling those unseen eyes drilling into my back. The echo of the footsteps in the attic pulsed in my mind, even though I could no longer hear them outright. I left the house, slept in my car parked a few blocks away, wherever I could find a space under a bright street lamp. Despite the distance, I couldn't shake the sensation that the house still watched me. My thoughts were consumed by that intangible presence and the claustrophobic darkness of the attic. At dawn, I toyed with the idea of calling someone to help investigate, but fear of ridicule and disbelief made me hesitate. Eventually, I decided to confront it in a different way, by reclaiming my home without trying to physically challenge whatever was there. So I returned in the early morning, just as the first rays of sunlight slid over the roof. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The atmosphere still felt charged, but less aggressive in daylight. I lit every lamp, opened every window, and let fresh air flood in. My heart still pounded. I was certain I could feel a presence behind me each time I moved from room to room, but I refused to let it immobilize me. Instead of going back into the attic, I stood beneath the hatch and spoke firmly, more to myself than to anything else, that this was my house. I insisted in a shaky voice that I would not be driven out. The only direct response was the faint rattle of the hatch door, as though it was testing my resolve. I have stayed here since, though my nights remain restless. The footsteps persist, especially during the late hours when the wind is still and I'm most vulnerable to my fears. At times the house feels almost normal, but then a sudden chill will race down my spine, and I'll know I'm being watched again. The corridor remains the worst part. Passing under the attic hatch triggers a deep, primal dread in me. Yet I continue to live here. I have put in new locks, installed brighter lights, and tried every rational strategy to hold on to my sanity. While the house no longer slams the ladder shut on me, I still hear that slow, deliberate tread pacing overhead each night. Sometimes it's faint, a distant echo that might be confused with the wind. If only it didn't stop so precisely above wherever I stand. I haven't found a neat resolution or a clear explanation for what haunts me. Part of me wonders if the house itself is alive, saturated with generations of secrets. Another part of me suspects some psychological fracture in my mind, the result of stress and isolation. Whatever the case, the feeling of those unseen eyes never truly fades. If anything, it's become a constant reminder that reality can fray at its edges, revealing glimpses of a realm we'd rather pretend doesn't exist. I've accepted that I may never fully prove or disprove the existence of something in my attic. But every time I climb the stairs and stand in the hallway with that hatch overhead, I feel a silent confrontation. The air crackles with tension, my heartbeat accelerates, my breath turns shallow, and sweat cools on my temples. In those moments, I sense that I'm inches away from another confrontation. For now, I endure, living in uneasy truce. Some nights, I manage a few hours of sleep without hearing a single step. Others, the footsteps are relentless, pulling me from slumber into heart-pounding alertness. And I realize the worst horror isn't the footsteps themselves, nor the possibility of some entity lurking above. It's the profound uncertainty, wondering when the next incident will happen, feeling the oppressive gaze in every mirror and corner, listening for sounds in the attic when the house should be quiet. That constant anxiety coils in my gut, whispering that I'm never truly safe here, but also that I can't simply flee. Whether it's madness or the supernatural, it's become part of my life now, ingrained like the dust in the attic floor. Every day I brace myself for the final revelation that might never come. haunted by the knowledge that the real terror is the anticipation of what lurks behind locked doors and above silent ceilings, waiting to be acknowledged. I remember the first time my heart threatened to pound its way out of my chest in that living room. It was a damp evening, the kind that wraps the walls in a silent, suffocating humidity. My dog Toby, a gentle soul who usually greeted strangers with an eager wag, stood stiff-legged, hair bristling, growling at the corner where I kept an iron crucifix. My blood ran cold the moment I realized he wasn't barking for any discernible reason. There was no noise, no shift in the light, nothing that I could see or hear. Yet Toby stood fixed, his teeth bared, his body tense in a way I'd never seen before. Something in that corner demanded his attention, and his reaction was far from normal. The next morning, after a mostly sleepless night, I tried to convince myself it was just a stray sound that set him off. Maybe the pipes had rattled, or a neighbor's footsteps reverberated through the floorboards. But as I shuffled into the living room, barefoot and groggy, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The crucifix was no longer upright. It was bent backward, twisted in a way that suggested force far beyond mere gravity or an accidental bump. I stared at it for a few heartbeats, feeling a prickly sensation travel up my spine. Toby let out a quiet whine from the doorway, refusing to set a single paw in that corner. Even when I called him close and tossed treats toward the area, he sidestepped around it, refusing to go near the bent crucifix. My hand shook as I reached for it. The iron felt strangely cold, like it had been stashed in a freezer overnight. That day, a weight hung over me, an anxious knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. The living room, which once felt cozy, now felt choked with a thick, invisible fog. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed dimmer, as if the curtains had been dipped in ash. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every time I passed by that corner, I thought I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a fleeting shadow, gone the moment I turned my head. My palms grew clammy, and my heart thumped with a dull roar in my ears. I tried to stay calm, occupying myself with small tasks around the house. I vacuumed the rugs, arranged books on the shelves, and cleaned the kitchen counters until they gleamed. Yet Toby's behavior only got stranger. He would lurk near the threshold of the living room, peering inside as though expecting something to leap out. Occasionally, he emitted a muffled bark or a low whine. Each time, my chest tightened as if a cold hand were squeezing my lungs. By late afternoon, my nerves were frayed. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, from the suffocating tension in my own home. That night, I settled into bed determined to sleep. But around 2 a.m., a sound jolted me awake, the unmistakable rumble of a growl. I sat up quickly, blinking away the haze of slumber. Toby lay at my side, wide awake, ears perked, his lips pulling back to reveal a silent snarl. The noise that had awoken me wasn't his doing. I heard it again, a raspy, throaty growl echoing from the hallway. My heart hammered so violently I thought I might vomit. I reached for the lamp switch with trembling fingers, and as the bulb flared to life, the growl ceased. Toby remained on alert, but the noise vanished into the stillness of the house. An acidic taste filled my mouth. I felt dizzy, as though the air had thinned, leaving me lightheaded. Struggling to maintain some semblance of normalcy, I went through my daily routine. I brewed coffee, stared out the window at the bleak sky, and tried to breathe through the all-consuming dread that lingered like a storm cloud overhead. My mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it had been a stray animal outside, the wind rattling a loose shutter, or simply a half-remembered dream conjured by my anxious mind. But Toby's perpetual unease dismissed all those rationalizations. His behavior had never been like this before. He refused to enter the living room completely, instead remaining in the hallway as if guarding me from something within those walls. I made a few calls to friends, describing my dog's distress in vague terms. Most suggested I take him to a veterinarian, or maybe consider an animal behaviorist. I couldn't bring myself to mention the twisted crucifix or the eerie nighttime growl. Part of me worried about their reactions. I didn't want to sound unhinged. Another part of me feared hearing the logical explanation they might provide, because deep inside, I suspected something far beyond logic was happening. As dusk approached again, I felt the tension in my chest coil tighter. The setting sun painted the sky in garish shades of orange and red, colors that seemed to bleed through my windows, bathing the living room in a sickly glow. The corner with the crucifix seemed to deepen, as if the shadows had thickened into a tangible presence. My breathing grew shallow, and I forced myself to flick on every lamp and overhead light in the house. Toby stayed glued to my heel, his tail tucked between his legs. At around 11 p.m., an overwhelming sense of dread enveloped me. I couldn't focus on anything. My vision seemed to blur at the edges, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like distant drums echoing through a cave. My pulse raced, and a cold sweat clung to my temples. Images of the twisted crucifix kept flashing in my mind, and each time my stomach lurched. I found myself pacing back and forth, checking the locks on my doors, then rechecking them until I lost count. Toby kept pacing along with me, occasionally pausing to let out a trembling whimper. When midnight arrived, I felt compelled to confront the corner directly. Perhaps it was a moment of desperation. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing there. So I marched into the living room, ignoring the fact that Toby stopped at the doorway and refused to follow. The air felt heavier the closer I got to the crucifix, as if I were wading through water. My skin prickled, and a faint metallic taste coated my tongue. The crucifix lay exactly where I had placed it after finding it bent. It should have been a comfort to see it untouched, yet I felt no relief. A rush of cold air brushed against the back of my neck. Goosebumps erupted across my arms. The overhead light flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. My breath caught in my throat and my heart clattered against my ribcage. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was just a power surge or an electrical glitch. But deep down, every nerve in my body screamed that it was something else, something far more sinister. That night, sleep eluded me completely. Around 3 a.m., I heard the growl again. This time it was closer, reverberating through the hallway as though something stood mere feet from my bedroom door. Toby sprang up, barking, but the sound that answered wasn't a typical bark. It was deeper, harsher, almost wet-sounding, as if the lungs producing it were damaged or inhuman. My entire body trembled with raw terror. I stayed in bed, paralyzed, while Toby seemed torn between wanting to protect me and wanting to flee. Eventually, the growling subsided into silence, leaving me soaked in sweat, my heart thudding so fiercely I could hardly catch my breath. A question burrowed into my mind and refused to let go. Was I losing my sanity? Was there a chance that this was all some twisted hallucination, a byproduct of stress, insomnia, or an overactive imagination? The following morning, I found the crucifix moved again. This time it wasn't only twisted, but also placed upside down on the ground, as though planted there deliberately. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the sticky sheen of sweat on my palm. My stomach churned. I couldn't rationalize that kind of force or that kind of precision. It looked as though someone, something, had gripped the iron and reversed it with ease. Toby barked from behind me, but even as he voiced his alarm, he refused to come near. I thought about seeking some form of help, maybe a spiritual advisor, or at least someone with a strong stomach for the unexplainable. But as the day wore on, I couldn't bring myself to do it. My pride insisted I handle it. My fear of being labeled insane kept my phone resting on the kitchen counter, untouched. I kept busy by rearranging furniture, hoping to dislodge whatever negative energy might be clinging to that corner. Yet each time I moved something, I felt a wave of nausea, as if I were disturbing a presence that wanted everything to remain exactly as it was. Night came again, and with it, an oppressive gloom that seeped into my bones. Every corner of the house seemed to seethe with unseen tension. The flickering bulbs, the faint creaks, and Toby's incessant pacing raked my nerves until I was convinced I might snap. By 2 a.m., the house was a prison of darkness, and a suffocating sense of doom pressed down on my chest. I felt too alert to sleep, yet too exhausted to stay coherent. That was when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. They weren't frantic or hurried, just a slow, methodical approach. My skin crawled, and my heart pounded so violently that my vision pulsed with each beat. Toby let out a strangled yelp and hid beneath the bed. I could hear his nails scraping against the floor as he tried to push himself even further away from the door. My mouth went dry. I clutched the blankets, every muscle rigid, breath rasping as if I had run a marathon. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. Silence coiled in the air like a viper, ready to strike. Then came a low, guttural growl, the same unearthly sound that had stalked my nights. Adrenaline surged through me, and I felt lightheaded, on the verge of passing out. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking so violently I almost collapsed. Each step toward the door felt like crossing an impossible distance. My mind screamed at me to stop, to barricade myself, to do anything but open that door. Still, a grim resolve pushed me forward. I wanted this to end. When I finally yanked open the door, the hallway was empty, not a single sign of movement, no footprints, no lingering figure, only the overhead light flickering with a soft buzz. My muscles turned to jelly, and I leaned against the door frame, gasping for air. Toby poked his head out from under the bed, whining softly. I didn't know which of us was more afraid at that moment. I made up my mind that if I was going to live in that house another night, I needed to confront the corner in the living room, to do something symbolic, perhaps to reverse whatever hold it had on me and on Toby. With trembling resolve, I gathered a small bowl of water, the only semblance of a cleansing ritual I could think of on short notice. The air felt suffocatingly heavy as I approached that cursed spot. Every hair on my body bristled, and a cold sweat trickled down my back. The crucifix lay there, still upside down, mocking my attempts at normality. I picked it up with unsteady hands. A shock of cold traveled from my fingertips to my wrist, as if I'd stuck my hand in a bucket of ice water. My stomach lurched, yet I forced myself to hold it upright. Then, in a wavering whisper, I muttered under my breath a plea for peace, words that I'm not even sure came out in any coherent form. The crucifix felt heavier than it should have, as though something weighed it down or resisted me. As I placed it back on the wall, Toby started barking from the other side of the room. His bark was frantic and sharp, like a warning. In the periphery of my vision, the corner seemed to ripple, as though heat waves were distorting the air. The overhead light flickered wildly, plunging the room into staccato bursts of darkness. My heart thundered. I could barely breathe. The wave of cold intensified, seeping into my bones. But then, almost as suddenly as it began, the flickering stopped. The air stilled. Toby's barking subsided into frightened whimpers. I found myself panting, drenched in sweat, my legs on the verge of buckling. I scanned the room, half expecting some hideous shape to reveal itself. Yet everything remained painfully normal. The furniture sat exactly where I'd placed it. The walls stood silent, and the crucifix now hung upright, albeit slightly bent. My entire body trembled in the aftermath of a tension I couldn't fully describe. For the next few minutes, I simply stood there, forcing air in and out of my lungs and trying to slow my racing pulse. Toby cautiously made his way over to me, pressing his body against my leg. His presence offered some semblance of comfort. We both stared at the crucifix, and although the corner still felt vaguely oppressive, it no longer hummed with that malevolent energy. I realized then that perhaps whatever force had been tormenting us wanted to feed on our fear and uncertainty. By confronting it, by refusing to hide, we might have disrupted its hold. Yet even with that realization, I couldn't ignore the persistent feeling that the house had changed. It was as if a new layer of darkness had settled in, waiting. Part of me felt triumphant for having at least stood my ground. Another part remained deeply unsettled, convinced that this confrontation could have merely been the beginning of something I wasn't equipped to understand. In the days that followed, Toby gradually began stepping closer to the living room corner. He'd sniff around, ears perked, tail lowered, but not tucked completely. I noticed the oppressive atmosphere wasn't as thick. and I could walk through the house without my heart racing every time I passed a doorway. But nighttime still held lingering echoes of the unknown. I'd occasionally wake to the faintest growl in the corridor, though it seemed distant, as if it were coming from a place only partially in this world. I can't say I ever fully felt at ease again. The twisted crucifix, now bent back into shape as best I could manage, serves as a constant reminder that something unexplainable once took root in my home. Each time my dog hesitates at the threshold of the living room, I'm reminded that the boundary between normalcy and horror can be disarmingly thin. Even now, I sometimes catch a flicker of movement or hear a distant, low rumble in the dead of night. My pulse quickens each time, fear licking at the edges of my thoughts like a slow-burning flame. I stay in the house because I refuse to run. I tell myself that by living here, by facing that corner every day, I'm pushing back against the darkness. Whether it's true or just a story I use to keep my sanity intact, I may never know. But I do know that the iron crucifix remains on my wall, slightly crooked, a silent testament to whatever clash took place in my living room. And whenever I sense that creeping dread, I feel the echo of that unimaginable cold against my skin, the flickering lights, and the deep, otherworldly growl. It hasn't truly left. I'm not sure it ever will. Yet, in some perverse way, I've learned to endure it, living each day in fragile balance with whatever lurks just beyond human sight. I remember the first moment I felt that chill in my chest, as though an invisible hand had slipped through my rib cage and clutched my heart. It happened in the darkest hours of an unfamiliar night, inside a guest room that felt more like a sealed crypt than a place of rest. Even now, recalling that single suffocating moment sets my pulse racing, reminding me that some experiences defy logic. The memory lingers, a shadow that seemed to hover just above my face, oppressive and damp like stale air in a forgotten cellar. It was a night that forever changed the way I perceived silence and darkness. I had been staying at my friend's house for a short visit. He had warned me in a casual, half-laughing tone that the guest room was underused and might be a bit musty. He never said anything about odd noises or strange phenomena, only that I might need extra blankets because the old radiator had a habit of going cold in the middle of the night. The day had been ordinary enough: coffee in the morning, a quick drive around the neighborhood, a long talk in his living room while we sipped tea. We were simply catching up, discussing life changes and recent job frustrations. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I had no reason to suspect that his house hid any unusual secrets or lurking presences. Yet, something nagged at me the moment I stepped into that guest room. The air felt heavier, as though gravity had changed just behind that threshold. The walls were painted an off-white color, but in the dim overhead lighting, they had a pale gray tint. A small lamp on the nightstand emitted a weak, yellowish glow. The bed itself was old-fashioned, the mattress creaking when I sat down. The first little warning sign came in the form of a faint buzzing in my ears. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or a residual effect of the day's stress. But as I ran my fingers along the floral-patterned wallpaper, I noticed a persistent undercurrent of static tension, like the room was quietly humming a tune only it could hear. My friend knocked on the door, wanting to confirm I was comfortable. I responded that everything was fine, though a subtle unease made my voice falter. He said something along the lines of, "Don't mind any odd noises. This place can creak at night." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the flickering shadows. I could have followed him, told him about the strange feeling in my chest, but it sounded foolish. I decided to shrug it off. Perhaps it was just nerves or the typical awkwardness of sleeping in someone else's home. As I prepared for bed, my eyes kept darting to the corners of the room. The overhead light had a faint pulse, as if it were on the verge of burning out. Every corner seemed abnormally dark, a darkness with a texture, as though it swirled in place. I tried to brush it off. After all, it's common for the mind to conjure shapes in peripheral vision, especially when tired. So, I switched off the main light and turned on the bedside lamp, hoping its gentler glow might lull me to sleep. I slipped under the covers, noticing how cold the sheets felt despite the late summer weather. The mattress springs groaned, and for a split second I thought I heard an echo of that sound in the corner of the room. A moment later, everything became silent, as if the house itself had paused to listen. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, but I convinced myself that I was overreacting. I focused on my breath, long and deep, trying to calm my nerves. Eventually my eyelids grew heavy, and the swirl of half-formed anxieties faded into a dreamless slumber. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I snapped awake. The darkness was overwhelming. My bedside lamp had gone out, and the radiator was ice cold. The air held a slight dampness, like a dank basement. That was when I felt it, an oppressive presence, leaning over me as if it were searching for something just beneath my skin. My eyes struggled to adjust, but all I could see was blackness that appeared to shift, almost like tendrils of smoke. My heart raced, and my tongue felt dry and useless in my mouth. I couldn't summon the courage to move at first. My ears picked up a low, almost guttural noise near my left ear, a reverberation that seemed to vibrate along my jawbone. Goosebumps spread across my arms, and cold sweat formed at the nape of my neck. With each labored breath, my chest felt more constricted, as if the atmosphere had thickened. The presence was so close, I nearly believed I could feel it exhaling against my cheek. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn on the light, to chase away whatever was happening. But I also felt paralyzed, pinned down by the intensity of that moment. It was a primal terror that defies logical explanation, like being a cornered animal, sensing that an unseen predator is about to pounce. Finally, desperation surged through me. I lunged for the bedside lamp, fumbling to flip the switch. The light blinked on, dim but blessedly steady. My eyes darted around the room. There was nothing there. No shape, no figure, only the old dresser, the bland wallpaper, the door firmly shut. Yet something felt off. The comforter beside me bore a very distinct outline, the unmistakable impression of weight, as though someone heavy had been kneeling there only moments before. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I pressed on the sunken area. It was cold to the touch, like a patch of snow in an otherwise mild landscape. That was when my breathing turned shallow, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The logical part of my brain insisted it was just a trick of the fabric, or maybe I had unconsciously pressed down on that spot in my sleep. However, the raw and immediate terror in my gut told me that something else had shared the bed with me, something I couldn't see but could sense on a visceral level. Unable to fall back asleep, I stayed awake, hugging my knees and keeping the lamp on until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the thin curtains. Every so often I thought I heard a faint creak or a shifting sound in the room, like the floorboards adjusting under a slow and methodical pressure. But when I looked, there was nothing. Eventually I drifted into an uneasy doze just as the sun rose high enough to brighten the walls. My body felt drained, as if I'd been running a marathon or fighting off a fever. Later that morning, I emerged from the guest room feeling haggard. My friend noticed my pale face and asked if I was all right. I explained, with measured words, that I had a rough night and possibly encountered the strangest bout of sleep paralysis I'd ever experienced. He offered a worried look, mentioning that another house guest in the past had also reported unsettling dreams in that room. He didn't elaborate much, but I could tell he felt uneasy discussing it. The conversation brought me no comfort, only increased the sense that I was caught in something beyond my understanding. Throughout the day, I tried to shake off the tension by staying in well-lit areas. My friend and I took a walk around the yard, noticing the slightly overgrown grass and the twisted branches of an old oak tree that loomed over part of the house. The wind rustled through the leaves with an unsettling whisper. Even outdoors, I couldn't entirely rid myself of the feeling that unseen eyes were observing me. My limbs felt stiff, and a dull ache spread behind my eyes. Twice I thought I saw flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. A dark shape flitting behind the garage, a shifting shadow near the fence. But nothing was there when I turned to look directly. We returned inside for lunch, and while the house was bright with sunlight, it seemed oddly gloomy. The corridors felt narrower, the corners darker. I tried to convince myself that I was on edge only because of my sleepless night. After all, We often see what we fear when our mind is clouded by fatigue. Still, an inexplicable heaviness settled in my stomach whenever I ventured close to the guest room door. I could almost taste the anxiety at the back of my throat, a metallic tang mixed with the dryness of fear. My friend suggested I stay another night, but he offered that I could rest in the living room on the couch if I felt uneasy about the guest room. I declined, telling him I'd be fine, and that I intended to face my irrational fears head-on. But as evening approached, a quiet dread seeped into my bones. The golden rays of the setting sun cast elongated shadows on the walls, and I noticed how those shadows seemed to crawl, inching their way across the house's interior with a predatory slowness. My heart fluttered whenever I recalled that sound I had heard near my ear, the low, throaty rasp that suggested something inhuman. Later, when my friend retired to his bedroom, I lingered in the hallway, uncertain if I should go back into the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the dim interior. The overhead light was off, and the silhouette of the dresser against the far wall looked warped, as if something had bent it in the half-darkness. My chest tightened, and my feet felt rooted to the floor. An irrational part of me wanted to run outside and spend the night in my car, but I forced myself to step inside. The air felt colder than before, with a subtle dampness that clung to the walls. I turned on the bedside lamp immediately, leaving the overhead light off. The corners remained deeply shadowed, and I had a sense that they were deeper than they should be, as if the geometry of the room had changed. When I closed the door, a faint draft brushed against my neck. I shivered, remembering that sense of being breathed upon. Trying to stay calm, I set my phone on the nightstand and kept its flashlight function ready, just in case. Hours passed with no major disturbances, though I couldn't relax enough to drift into a peaceful sleep. My heart was still beating faster than normal, and my skin felt clammy. Occasionally the radiator clanked, sending a hollow echo through the room that made my nerves spike. I turned over, burying my face in the pillow, attempting to block out the oppressive aura. Just as I was beginning to doze, I heard a faint scraping sound from the far corner. It was like someone dragging their nails lightly across the wall. My stomach flipped, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. Summoning courage, I clicked on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the corner. The beam caught only the bland wallpaper and a small wooden chair. But just as I was about to turn away, I caught a flicker, a formless darkness, a distortion in the air, receding into itself. My breath caught, and a tremor ran through me like an electric shock. I couldn't be certain if it was a shadow cast by something outside or a trick of my stressed mind. Yet I felt watched. I tried to speak, to demand that whatever it was show itself, but my throat felt constricted. Instead, a raspy whisper escaped my lips, more like a plea than a command. The atmosphere in the room seemed to condense, pressing on me with invisible hands. My vision blurred for a moment, and I sensed a presence weaving through the dark corners, circling me like a predatory animal waiting for the right moment. The hair on my arms stood on end, and my teeth chattered lightly despite the warmth of the blankets. Then abruptly, the light on the nightstand flickered and went out. My phone's flashlight remained my only source of illumination. My heart pounded so violently that I felt it might burst. I spun the beam of light around, searching for the cause of the blackout, but there was no visible reason. The lamp was plugged in, yet the bulb refused to glow. At that instant, a deep resonance, a guttural, vibrating hum, filled the air. It felt like it was coming from all sides, reverberating in my skull. I struggled to breathe as the tone surrounded me, vibrating my teeth, rattling my bones. Desperate, I scrambled out of bed and yanked open the door, stumbling into the hallway. The house was dark. The corridor light was also off. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fought the urge to panic. Gripping my phone, I navigated toward the living room. I intended to leave, to just walk out the front door and not look back. Yet an irrational pull made me hesitate at the base of the stairs. I glanced back down the hallway, toward the guest room. My flashlight revealed only an empty, silent corridor. No shape or figure stood there. Still, that lingering sense of being watched crawled over my skin like spiders. Despite my overwhelming dread, I found myself stepping back into the room one last time, determined to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The air inside seemed heavier now, dense with an unidentifiable energy. The bed was as I left it, sheets tangled, lamp dark, but on the mattress I saw a deep indentation, as though something, had been perched on the edge. It sent a jolt of terror straight through my spine. My eyes watered, and I felt a tremor in my hands that made the flashlight beam quiver. No matter how hard I tried to find a reasonable explanation, my mind returned to that intangible presence I had felt in the darkness. That was enough for me. Clutching my phone, I backed away, never turning my back to the room until I reached the threshold. I decided then and there to spend the remainder of the night in the living room, fully dressed, lights on, my pulse still racing. I waited out the hours, the hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen acting like an anchor to the real world. Every so often, I imagined that low growl in my ear again, or caught a glimpse of swirling shadows outside my line of sight. I rubbed my eyes, questioning my sanity, wondering if lack of sleep had made me hallucinate. But the impressions on the bed, the cold patch on the comforter, those things felt all too real. Eventually, dawn arrived, its pale light filtering through the blinds. My friend found me hunched on the couch, eyes bloodshot, and asked if I'd been up all night. I nodded, too drained to offer a coherent explanation. I mumbled something about strange occurrences, the swirls of darkness, and an unmistakable physical presence near me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, offering a concerned expression. He said he understood and wouldn't press me for details if I preferred to keep them to myself. His tone suggested he believed me, or at least believed that I believed what I experienced. I left that morning, driving away with the windows down to let the cold air whip against my face and keep me alert. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help imagining that smoky darkness clinging to the trunk or swirling in the back seat, waiting for nightfall to manifest again. I clenched the steering wheel, heart thudding in my chest, trying to focus on the road and ignore the bizarre feeling that I had escaped by the thinnest margin. Even now, safe in my own home, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that same low, resonant growl. My skin prickles with an echo of that haunting presence. In my mind's eye, I see the imprint on the comforter, the swirling dark corners, and the silent weight that pressed down so close to me. And though I try to reason it away, blaming it on stress, exhaustion, or an overactive imagination, some nights I swear the darkness in my own bedroom seems to shift, as though it, too, is quietly alive. And in those moments, I wonder if the entity I encountered truly stayed behind in that old guest room, or if it followed me, patiently waiting for the darkness to settle once again. The night air felt unnaturally heavy, as if it clung to my skin in sheets of clammy darkness. The garden behind my colleague's house was supposed to be a tranquil place, rows of shrubs, a modest fence, and a few lanterns providing a soft glow. Yet from the moment I stepped onto the grass, I sensed an undercurrent of dread. My heart thrummed in my ears, and every exhalation seemed to echo too loudly. It was then, in the shifting moonlight, that I noticed a hidden shape among the foliage. A small wooden door that looked old, warped, and oddly out of place. That discovery was the beginning of my descent into an experience I can only describe as an unraveling of reality. I recall squinting at the door, trying to figure out how I had never seen it before. It seemed set into the fence, but the surrounding boards were twisted in a way that made the door appear older, like a centuries-old piece of driftwood lodged among newer planks. My gut tightened with a strange mix of curiosity and unease. A breeze stirred the leaves and carried a faint scent of something burnt, like old incense that had been sitting in a temple for decades. My breaths became shallow. My skin went cold. I reached out and touched the handle, half expecting the door to be sealed shut by rust. To my surprise, the latch gave way with a dull clunk, and the door creaked open onto absolute darkness. I hesitated, leaning forward to glimpse what lay beyond. A corridor stretched out from the threshold, illuminated at its far end by a weak, flickering light that cast a warm glow on the corridor walls. The air that seeped from inside was stale and heavy, tinged with that same pungent incense smell that settled on my tongue like moldy spice. An immediate sense of foreboding seized my chest. I could hear something, whispers, almost imperceptible, like distant chanting muffled by thick walls. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Despite every instinct screaming that I should walk away, I felt compelled to step inside. Perhaps it was a misguided sense of bravery or sheer stupidity, but I moved forward until I was fully inside that enclosed darkness. My footsteps echoed against the stone floor. The corridor was cramped, just wide enough for me to extend my arms and brush the walls on both sides with trembling fingertips. Small trickles of moisture dripped down the walls, slick with condensation. Each step took me closer to that flickering light, closer to the source of those maddening whispers. I swore I could feel eyes on me, peering from shadowy corners of the corridor. My heart thumped faster with every inch I progressed. Then, as if in a dream, I reached what looked like an alcove. The chanting grew clearer. Though the words were indecipherable, the rhythm made me feel sick to my stomach. I froze, trying to steady my breathing, aware that my palms were sweating so profusely, I almost lost my grip on the door's rusted iron lock. A noise startled me from behind, a scrape on the floor that made my entire body jolt. My vision blurred for a moment, and the corners of my eyesight darkened. I turned around so abruptly that a dizzy spell nearly floored me. The corridor behind me stretched back into darkness, yet I could see the faint outline of the open door. The chanting seemed to be coming from all directions. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I felt an indescribable panic building inside me, as though something was about to emerge from the dim alcove. In a surge of desperate courage, I grabbed hold of that iron lock mechanism, loose now in my sweaty grip, and wrenched it from the door. Metal scraped on wood, sending an ear-splitting squeal through the corridor. My flight response took over. I pivoted, stumbling on the uneven stones, and made for the exit with every ounce of energy in my body. My lungs felt as though they might burst. The corridor walls seemed to press in, as if trying to trap me. I slipped through the threshold, feeling a rush of cool night air on my clammy skin, and nearly collapsed on the grass outside. My chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, my skin buzzing with adrenaline. For a moment, I could still hear the echoes of chanting drifting from the corridor, the voices tangling with the night wind. That was when I yelled for my colleague, my voice cracking with unhinged fear. He was inside the house, probably in the kitchen or living room. I staggered to the back door, clinging to the iron lock in my hand as if it were an anchor. My heart pounded so violently that I felt lightheaded. When my colleague joined me, I tried to explain what had happened. My words tumbled out in a frantic, disorganized rush, describing the old wooden door, the corridor, the smell of incense, and the eerie chanting. He listened with a confused expression, his brow furrowing deeper with each sentence. According to him, there had never been any door along that fence, not even a small gate. Trying to remain calm, he agreed to follow me out to the garden to see for himself. My skin prickled as we made our way through the yard. The same patch of foliage rustled in the breeze. I pointed, indicating exactly where I had found the door just moments ago. But there was nothing there now. No warped planks, no rusted handle, and no sign that a door had ever existed. The fence was seamless, a continuous stretch of wooden boards that looked completely undisturbed. For a few seconds, I was convinced I'd had some sort of waking nightmare, but then I glanced down at my hand. I was still holding the iron lock, its metal worn and tinged with rust. It was proof that I hadn't imagined the entire ordeal. My colleague's eyes widened in disbelief when I placed the lock in his hand. The weight of it seemed to confirm that something impossible had just occurred. The following day, I could hardly focus on anything else. My colleague tried to reassure me that maybe it was an old piece of hardware I had found in the garden, but even he sounded unconvinced. Each time I replayed the corridor in my mind, my pulse quickened and a thick dryness spread across my tongue. I told myself it was just some bizarre trick of perception, Maybe exhaustion, plus the dim moonlight, had conjured up illusions. Yet I couldn't forget how real it had felt, how the chanting had made my skin crawl. I kept examining the iron lock. Its surface bore intricate patterns, as though it once belonged to something older and far stranger than a simple garden gate. In the days that followed, I returned to the fence multiple times, searching for any sign that might confirm what I'd experienced. Each visit left me in an escalating state of anxiety. I would stand in the garden, scanning every inch of the fence, touching the wooden boards and hoping to find that hidden seam. I never found it, but on several occasions I caught the faintest whiff of stale incense that made my stomach churn. A creeping paranoia sank into my everyday life. My head felt permanently heavy, and I jumped at the smallest noises. A cupboard closing, a door creaking in another room. My nights were restless, plagued by half-remembered dreams of winding corridors and flickering lights. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering like a drum. One afternoon, the tension in my chest grew so overwhelming that I decided to confront it head-on. I told my colleague, in a halting voice, that I needed to explore that area of the garden more thoroughly. He appeared wary but acquiesced, likely sensing I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I felt no small amount of shame for dragging him into this, yet I couldn't face the possibility of returning to that spot alone. We combed through the bushes and shrubs, rummaging through fallen leaves and damp dirt. My colleague mentioned, in a murmur of concern, that he'd never known the fence to have any kind of secret entrance. He also expressed worry that I was letting this consume me. I remember offering a strained laugh, telling him I just needed closure. As we pushed aside layers of foliage, I got on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the fence boards. My breath sounded deafening in my head, and my heart pounded so hard that it almost drowned out the hushed ambient sounds of the yard. I listened, wanting desperately to hear something, anything that might indicate the corridor's presence. At first there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves. Then faintly, I caught a whisper. It might have been the wind, or my rattled nerves playing tricks on me, but it carried a cadence eerily similar to the chant I had heard inside that dreadful passage. I scrambled back, heart in my throat, scanning the fence. No door, no gap, just that unbroken line of wood. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned the corridor's walls, dripping with condensation and closing in around me. The chanting echoed in my mind. My entire body prickled with sweat. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like I was teetering on the edge of some irreversible breakdown. I forced myself out of bed and switched on every light in my apartment. My breathing was so unsteady that my sides ached. In the fluorescent glow of the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of a window. My face looked hollow, my skin sallow, as though I were being drained by my own obsession. Clenching my fists, I tried to remind myself that I still had the iron lock as evidence. Somehow, that physical object was both a comfort and a curse. A reminder that I wasn't simply losing my mind, but also a tether to a reality that should not exist. Over the next several days, I started noticing small but unsettling shifts in my environment. The house felt colder than usual, even when the heater was running. Electrical appliances would flicker, their hum distorted in a way that made my ears ring. The aroma of old incense turned up unpredictably, drifting through hallways and rooms like a phantom presence. Sometimes at the corner of my vision, I would catch a fleeting shape, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs, skirting just out of sight. My hair stood on end whenever it happened. I tried to dismiss these glimpses as stress-induced hallucinations, but they grew more frequent. My colleague grew increasingly worried and insisted we talk about it. He suggested I take a break, maybe even see a professional, but I couldn't bear the thought. Part of me believed that acknowledging it formally would make it all the more real. One evening I decided to confront the fence alone under the cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight, I trudged through the garden's damp grass. My breath formed small clouds in the chilly air. The beam of the flashlight wavered because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I half expected to see the wooden door reappear. Instead, I found an ordinary fence, the boards as mundane and plain as any suburban boundary. A wave of frustration and dread washed over me. I pressed my palm against the fence and felt the familiar ridges of the wood. As I began to turn away, a strange warmth radiated through my hand. I looked down in panic, sure the fence felt hot to the touch. Then, in a jarring burst, the flashlight flickered, and I caught sight of the corridor for an instant. Just a fleeting image of that flickering light and damp stone walls. My heart lurched violently. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and the vision vanished as quickly as it came. The fence stood smooth and unbroken once more, but the stale incense smell was thick in the air, clinging to my nostrils and weighing on my tongue. I raced back to the house, every hair on my body standing upright. Once inside, I sank to my knees, my pulse pounding in my ears. The corridor's brief reappearance confirmed that I wasn't merely reliving a single hallucination. It was real, and it was somehow tethered to that spot in the garden. The chanting still haunted my memory, those unintelligible voices that seemed to call from just beyond the edge of reason. My entire body trembled, my muscles aching from the tension coiled within them. In the days that followed, I stopped going to my colleague's house altogether. He tried to persuade me to return, saying it would help me overcome the fear, but I refused. I couldn't risk another glimpse of that impossible doorway. I focused on work, on trying to reacquaint myself with normalcy, though I felt the corridor beckoning in the back of my mind. Even in my apartment, the air sometimes carried that suffocating incense odor, and I caught myself obsessively checking corners and closets for any sign of hidden openings. Nightmares became a routine, and each morning I woke with the taste of coppery dread on my tongue. Finally, I decided to seal the iron lock in a box and stow it in my closet. Perhaps parting with that tangible proof would loosen the corridor's grip on my psyche. For several nights, things seemed marginally better. My heartbeat slowed to a more manageable pace, and I slept without seeing those dripping walls. But on the final night of my ordeal, something chilling happened. I woke in the small hours, my room dark except for a faint glow from the street lamp outside. A soft scraping sound emanated from within my closet, like metal sliding against wood. My entire body tensed, muscles rigid with fright. Each breath felt razor-sharp in my throat. My mind conjured horrifying images of that corridor bleeding through the closet door. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, growing louder, then suddenly stopping. I sat there, drenched in sweat, my fingers digging into my sheets. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to open the closet. The box containing the iron lock was exactly where I'd placed it, but the lid was slightly ajar. My insides twisted with dread. The lock was sitting in the box, but its position was different from how I had left it. I had no explanation, no reason to believe anyone had tampered with it. I was alone in the apartment, yet the evidence lay right there, an undeniable sign that something was meddling with my reality. I realized then that my only hope of escaping this nightmare was to face the corridor on my own terms. I took the lock, feeling its cold metal resonate with my own trembling. I went back to my colleague's garden, and with the setting sun casting elongated shadows across the grass, I placed the lock on the fence where the door had once stood. The air felt suffocating. My lungs struggled to draw breath. I closed my eyes and, in a wavering voice, demanded in my mind that it let me go. I stood motionless for several minutes, heart pounding, skin clammy with sweat. Nothing happened. No door appeared. No chanting echoed through the yard. But as I opened my eyes, the smell of old incense swirled around me one last time, then dissipated like a fading nightmare. From that day forward, the garden fence remained ordinary. My colleague told me, in hushed tones, that he still sometimes noticed my distant stare whenever I came over. The corridor itself never reappeared, at least not visually. Yet I often sense it, lurking at the edge of my peripheral vision, or in the hollow echo of a quiet room. The iron lock remains where I left it, rusting against the fence, a grim reminder that some door had in fact been there, if only for a haunting moment in time. Even now, I'm not entirely sure whether I escaped or merely struck a temporary bargain with forces I cannot comprehend. The uneasy hush of the garden at night suggests that maybe my ordeal isn't over, and every so often in the dead silence of midnight, my body stiffens in recollection, half expecting to hear that muted chanting once more. It never comes, yet the tension never truly leaves. I carry the weight of that experience with me, aware that reality can shift in the blink of an eye. There are places that shouldn't exist, thresholds better left sealed. Sometimes I stand on the back porch, gazing at the fence in the moonlight, half convinced I can see the outline of the door and smell the incense drifting across the yard. My heart beats wildly at the possibility that one night I might find the door again, and that next time I may not be able to turn back. The night it happened, I remember standing on my narrow balcony, cigarette in hand, feeling the crisp air scrape my lungs. There was a hollow stillness all around, an unsettling hush that made the city lights seem more distant than usual. I took a slow drag, exhaling into the darkness, and that was when I saw it. A dense swirl of smoke that twisted and formed itself into an unmistakable face. It was old and lined, eyes hollow, yet focused. There was a split second when that face seemed to lock its gaze on me, mouth threatening to open. My lungs clenched, and my pulse hammered against my temples. The sickly sweet odor of extinguished candles invaded my senses, something I'd never associated with the smell of cigarette smoke. Then, as fast as it had appeared, the face dissolved back into the night. But the damage was done. My sense of reality cracked right then and there. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or a fleeting optical illusion. Yet, as I turned to go back inside, the reflection in the glass door wavered as though someone else were standing there, moving their head in a slow, deliberate arc. That sight made my stomach drop. My own reflection shouldn't move independently. My breath caught, and my chest tightened as though the very air had grown heavy. I stood frozen, a thin layer of sweat gathering at the back of my neck, half convinced that if I blinked, something would rush out from behind the glass. When I finally forced myself to slide the door open, I sensed a presence behind me. Every hair on my body seemed to stand on end, and I nearly stumbled over the threshold, slamming the door shut as though something were chasing me inside. The rest of that night was an exercise in self-deception. I paced in my living room, heart still jittering, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed. I considered the flickering hallway bulb, the glare from streetlights, my own nerves. But the memory kept replaying in my mind. That aged, smoky face and the smell of burnt wax. I stayed awake until dawn, finishing half a pack of cigarettes I'd sworn I'd quit months ago. Whenever I sat still, I was overtaken by the sensation of a gaze pressing upon me. My heart would pound, and beads of sweat would appear on my forehead. It was as if an invisible hand were gripping my collar. The next morning, exhausted and running on caffeine, I tried to put on a brave front. I had to meet a friend for lunch, and although part of me wanted to cancel, I forced myself to go out. I felt safer around people and noise. During that lunch, I mentioned, more as a joke than a confession, that I'd seen something unusual on my balcony. My friend offered a polite chuckle, suggesting maybe I'd had too much coffee or that I was stressed from work. I nodded, letting the conversation dissolve into other topics, but I couldn't stop my mind from drifting back to that haunting face. My friend's reassurance only underscored how unreal the incident sounded to anyone else. When I returned to my apartment, the atmosphere felt off, as if the rooms were darker even with all the lights switched on. The air felt stale, like it hadn't circulated in ages. My living room smelled faintly of something sweet and smoky, and I had the unpleasant notion that it might be the same candle scent from before. I walked around, flipping on lamps, opening windows, trying to force the space to feel normal again, but I couldn't escape the creeping tension coiling in my gut. My shoulders were stiff from bracing, and my breaths came in shallow bursts. The floors seemed to creak at odd intervals, as if someone else was shifting their weight in the next room, though I knew I was alone. That night I hesitated before stepping onto the balcony. My craving for a smoke was overshadowed by the memory of that face, but I also felt oddly compelled to confront what had happened. I told myself that if I saw something again, I could prove to myself once and for all whether this was just my imagination. With my heart pounding so intensely that I felt my pulse in my throat, I slid open the glass door. The cold air hit me like a warning. I lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. Each exhalation looked perfectly ordinary, just a shifting cloud of grayish vapor dissipating into the dark. Relief started to seep in, and I began to believe that perhaps the previous night had been a one-off hallucination. Then I glanced at the glass door again. My reflection was there, but it appeared slightly offset, like an image on a misaligned projector. My stomach flipped, and I blinked, hoping my eyes were just tired. My reflection blinked back, but the movement wasn't quite in sync. The hair on my neck stood up. I was sweating despite the cold. It felt like the reflection was fighting to match my motion, but was just a fraction of a second too late. In that moment, my fingers felt numb around the cigarette, and my lungs constricted as though I couldn't breathe properly. I gripped the railing, trying to steady myself, but the wave of vertigo hit me so hard I thought I'd pass out. I forced myself inside, closing the door once more. My reflection vanished from view as soon as I slid the curtain shut, leaving me with the frantic pounding of my heart and the dull hum of my apartment's overhead light. I felt unhinged. Every sound, pipes clanking, the refrigerator humming, the distant rumble of traffic, took on a sinister edge. It was as if my senses were dialed to an excruciatingly high volume. My skin was clammy, and my muscles ached from tension. In the following days, the presence persisted, even when I avoided smoking altogether. My mental state deteriorated in increments. I'd wake up at odd hours to the faint scrape of something against the walls, or the subtle shift of a shadow under my door. Sometimes I'd step into the bathroom, and the overhead light would flicker in a slow, rhythmic pattern. My reflection in the mirror seemed oddly elongated, as though gravity were pulling my features downward. I even started perceiving the reflection's eyes focusing on me, as if it were another person looking through a thin veil. On one particularly unsettling afternoon, I was washing dishes when I felt this sudden clamp around my chest, like invisible arms squeezing the air out of my lungs. I dropped a plate into the sink, the clatter reverberating through the kitchen. My vision blurred, and the smell of burnt candles assaulted me again. I stood there trembling, water running, heart pounding as if it were trying to escape my ribcage. It lasted just a few seconds, but it was enough to leave me gasping for breath, adrenaline coursing hot through my veins. I considered staying at a hotel or renting another place temporarily, but the thought of abandoning my apartment felt wrong. I've never liked the idea of running from my own home. Instead, I tried to fight back in small ways. I lit sage bundles, placed salt near the windows, and left the lights on at all times, hoping to banish whatever energy seemed to cling to the corners. I even looked up old superstitions, reading about how mirrors can trap spirits, or how certain incenses might ward off malicious forces. Each attempt brought only brief solace. The oppressive feeling would return within hours, like a heavy blanket thrown over me, leaving a sticky dampness of dread on my skin. As the weeks passed, my dreams grew disturbed. I started having strange nightmares involving corridors of mirrors, all reflecting a version of me that didn't move in sync. Sometimes I'd see that aged face from the smoke, standing at the end of the corridor, mouth hanging open as if trying to speak. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing. The candle smell would be there too, lingering in the pillowcase. It felt like I was carrying the presence with me wherever I went, even outside. A few times at the office, I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection in the elevator doors or windows, only to feel nauseated when it seemed to shift an instant too late. My coworkers began to notice my jumpiness. Someone said I looked worn out and asked if I was sleeping okay. I avoided answering directly, offering vague hints that I was dealing with personal stress. Inside, I was on the verge of panic at all hours. My hands sometimes shook, and I had difficulty focusing on simple tasks. Whenever a shadow flickered at the corner of my eye, I braced, waiting for something to leap at me. My own paranoia was wearing me down, making me question every moment of normalcy. I started to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. One evening, I decided I needed to face this thing more directly, to confront whatever was haunting my reflection. I turned off all the lights in the apartment except for a single lamp in the living room. The ambiance was dim and claustrophobic. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stood in front of the glass door leading to the balcony, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness outside. Slowly, I slid the door open, stepping out into the chilly night. I forced myself to stand there and look at the city lights, breathing methodically to keep my nerves in check. After a few minutes, I felt something shift in the air, as though a cold breeze had slithered around my ankles. I exhaled, watching the cloud of vapor swirl, half expecting the same ancient face to materialize. Instead, a faint glow caught my eye near the railing. It looked like the flicker of a candle flame, but it vanished as soon as I focused on it. My heart was pounding so fiercely that I felt slightly dizzy. I turned back to the glass door, and there it was again, my reflection, impossibly out of sync. I lifted my arm slowly, and the figure in the glass lagged by a fraction of a second. The eyes in that reflection were narrower, the face drawn tight, almost predatory. It felt as if I were staring at someone who wore my appearance like an ill-fitting mask. My mouth went dry, my jaw locked, and a surge of panic bubbled up in my chest. Yet something held me in place, compelled me to keep watching. The reflection tilted its head at a peculiar angle. My own head remained straight. My skin went cold, my muscles tensed, and fear washed over me in a suffocating wave. The presence seemed to grow thicker, like it was pressing against my back, urging me forward. I tried to breathe, but the air felt too dense. In a desperate moment of courage, or maybe sheer terror, I stepped right up to the glass, inches away from this twisted imitation of myself. My breath formed tiny clouds on the surface. I steadied my shaking hand and pressed it to the cold glass. The reflection's hand met mine from the other side, but something about its movement seemed sluggish, distorted. Then I saw the faint outline of that old face superimposed over my own, lips trembling as though trying to whisper something. I could practically taste the bitter tang of fear on my tongue. I don't know how long I stood there. It might have been seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My vision blurred, tears mixed with sweat, and my heart threatened to explode in my chest. At last, I wrenched myself away from the balcony, stumbling back inside and yanking the door shut. The reflection disappeared behind the curtain. I collapsed onto the couch, breath coming in ragged gasps, limbs trembling uncontrollably. It took several minutes before my pulse slowed enough to think clearly. In that trembling haze, I made a sudden decision. I would not let this thing devour me. Whether it was a trick of my mind or something else, I refused to cower any longer. I rummaged through my closet for an old storage blanket and draped it over the glass door, shutting out my reflection entirely. Then I gathered every mirror in the apartment. There weren't many, and covered them with sheets or flipped them against the walls. The process left me drenched in sweat, and my heart never stopped galloping. But once I was finished, the space felt calmer, albeit still far from peaceful. The presence didn't vanish, but it seemed subdued, as if it were struggling to find a surface to manifest. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my couch, eyes scanning every corner of the room, ears tuned to every creak and thump. My body stayed on high alert, but I felt a strange sense of defiance. When dawn broke through the slits of the blinds, I finally stood up, knees shaky. My decision was made. I would leave this apartment at least for a while. There was no shame in seeking temporary refuge if it meant preserving my sanity. With a heavy heart and a pounding chest, I packed a small bag, covering any reflective surface I came across. The apartment looked eerie and half-finished, a place in hiding. I opened the door one last time and stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of the presence lingering behind me. Just before I closed the door, the faintest hint of that candle smell drifted to my nose, as though offering a final warning. I'm not sure if I escaped the entity, or if it followed me, But I do know that the moment I left my apartment, my breath came a little easier. Even now, there's a haunting residue of that presence in the back of my mind, a creeping doubt that it might reappear in any reflective surface if I let my guard down. Whenever I see a window or a mirror, I still brace myself for a warped version of my own face, or for that ancient stare peering back at me. A part of me suspects this presence is just waiting for the right moment to catch me off guard. No matter where I go, I can't entirely shake the oppressive memory of that twisted reflection and the suffocating smell of burnt candles. Perhaps I never will, but I've come to accept that some things defy logic. Sometimes the darkness outside finds a way in, latching onto our deepest fears. And sometimes the only way to survive is to recognize that not every reflection is truly our own, and then learn to live, wide awake, with whatever looks back at us from the other side of the glass. From the very first night I moved into this apartment, there was a feeling that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Even before I noticed anything concrete, I sensed an unspoken tension coiling around the edges of every room. It was in the hush of the corridors, in the way the overhead light never seemed bright enough, and in the faint hum I could never quite locate. I tried to dismiss those impressions, blaming the stress of relocating and the echoing silence of an unfamiliar place. But denial only works for so long. When I first heard that inexplicable thump in the living room and found several books scattered on the floor, I couldn't ignore the crawling sense of unease any longer. I am a practical man. I prefer logic to superstition, order to chaos. Yet life in this apartment quickly became anything but orderly. After the first incident of books plummeting off shelves, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the shelf was unstable, or maybe I'd placed the books too close to the edge. The following evening, however, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard a distinct scraping sound. I shut off the faucet and tiptoed into the living room, only to see a small porcelain figurine sliding across the edge of a bookshelf, as though an unseen hand were pushing it. I stood frozen, heart pounding, breath trapped in my lungs. The figurine hung there for a split second, then fell and shattered on the floor. At that moment, a spike of dread shot up my spine. I tried to steady myself by gripping the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. My heart throbbed against my ribs, and I could feel my pulse pulsing in my ears. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, vibrations from the traffic outside, or maybe some bizarre draft. Yet no windows were open, and the doors were locked. That night I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Every so often I thought I heard faint rustling from the living room, as if someone were flipping through pages of the books I had hastily put back on the shelves. The sweat on my brow turned cold, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me, not knowing what else to do but wait for morning. I tried to act normal the next day. Before leaving for work, I rearranged the books more securely and threw the broken pieces of the porcelain figurine in the trash. I told myself to stop letting my imagination run wild, but I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were fixed on me, watching, waiting. At the office, I mentioned in passing to a colleague that strange things were happening at home, though I omitted specific details. He offered some half-hearted reassurance that old buildings can be quirky, and I feigned agreement, all the while feeling a growing knot of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. That evening, I settled on the couch, determined to relax with some mindless television. The living room lamp cast a weak yellow glow that left corners of the room in shadow. Despite the brightness of the TV screen, the atmosphere remained oppressive. My skin prickled at the slightest noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of neighbors walking in the hallway. Even my own breathing seemed too loud. Then, in my peripheral vision, I noticed the edge of a picture frame trembling. It stood on the TV stand, housing a photograph of my parents. I paused the show, squinting to see if it was a trick of the light. A moment later, the frame tipped forward as though flicked by an invisible finger and fell onto the floor. My heart stuttered. My hands turned clammy, and for a brief second, my mind went blank. Almost reflexively, I bolted from the couch, body stiff with tension. The dread was like a living thing, pressing down on me. I inhaled sharply, trying to calm myself. Then I heard a soft scraping sound. Turning back, I saw my TV remote sliding across the coffee table by itself, leaving a faint line in the thin layer of dust I'd neglected to wipe away. I stood there, arms trembling, as it slowly reached the table's edge. It teetered for an agonizing moment, then stopped, like some malevolent presence was toying with it. I remember that I couldn't speak. My throat was too dry, and even if I'd wanted to scream, it felt as though no sound could escape. A wave of nausea rose in my gut, and my heart pounded so fiercely I thought my ribs would crack. Then came the worst part. Something blew across the back of my neck, a chilling current of air, like the faintest sigh. I wheeled around, stumbling as I did, but no one was there. My mind reeled, trying to rationalize the sensation. Maybe there was a draft from the vent, but a glance at the ceiling showed no vents in that vicinity. I could almost swear it had been an actual breath, warm enough to flutter the hairs on my neck, yet cold in its implication. That was the moment I realized. I was sharing my apartment with something, or someone, unseen. For days after that, I was on edge from morning till night. Objects vanished without explanation. My glasses, which I was certain I'd left on the nightstand, reappeared hours later on top of the TV. A set of keys I was sure I'd left in the bowl by the door wound up near the foot of the sofa. Each instance felt more deliberate, as if something was orchestrating a game of hide-and-seek to grab my attention. My anxiety mounted to the point that every little noise, every creak, tap, or squeak, sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. My body remained constantly tense, jaw clenched, shoulders hunched, and my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. On multiple nights, I woke up in a cold sweat, certain I had heard footsteps moving across the living room floor. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there would be nothing there. Only a slightly open door or a curtain swaying as though recently disturbed. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was falling prey to stress-induced hallucinations. One evening, I dialed a friend's number, desperate for a second opinion. He said he was willing to come over and see for himself. When he arrived, I tried to describe the events, though I felt ridiculous recounting them. He suggested it might be my imagination, but agreed to spend an hour or two in the living room with me. During that time, not a single strange thing happened. No books fell, no air brushed our necks, no remote slid across the table. My friend left, looking almost concerned for my mental state, though he didn't say so outright. The moment he was gone, the door rattled in its frame behind him. Then I heard a soft tap from the shelf, as if some presence was letting me know it was still there. I started sleeping with the lights on. I hated the shadows, the illusions they cast on the walls, the way I felt they concealed something looming just out of sight. Even with the lights blazing, the apartment felt gloomier than ever, as though the very walls exuded an oppressive energy. My appetite vanished, replaced by a queasy tightness in my stomach. My head throbbed with tension headaches. At work, my colleagues asked if I was all right, noting my pale face and the dark circles under my eyes. I lied and said I was fighting off a cold. The more nights I spent in that apartment, the more I believed there was a consciousness behind these occurrences. It felt deliberate, purposeful, like someone silently demanding I acknowledge their presence. Sometimes I experienced a strange static in the air, an electric charge that lifted the tiny hairs on my arms. Other times, I could have sworn I heard faint whispers, though never words I could clearly decipher, just a subtle, ghostly murmur that would vanish the second I focused on it. My heart raced every time I caught it, and I found myself trembling without warning, my body locked in a fight-or-flight response. I tried small rituals to calm myself. I lit scented candles in an effort to make the place feel inviting. I walked from room to room, speaking in a hushed voice, insisting that whoever or whatever shared the apartment with me could rest peacefully. But the tension didn't subside. One night I felt compelled to open all the drawers and cabinets, as if searching for something that might explain the phenomena. An old letter, a hidden compartment. some clue about previous tenants. I found nothing but dusty shelves and the ordinary clutter of everyday life. The emptiness unsettled me even more. On one particularly sleepless night, I decided to sit quietly in the living room, determined not to run from whatever was happening. It was past midnight, and the only light came from a table lamp whose bulb flickered intermittently. The quiet was absolute, broken only by my own shaky inhalations. My heart pounded with such force that I felt it in my temples, and my palms were damp with sweat. For a long stretch of time, nothing moved. Then I heard a barely perceptible creaking to my left. I turned slowly, the breath catching in my throat, half expecting a figure to emerge from behind the bookshelf. The topmost row of books, which I had carefully arranged days ago, had begun to shift. One by one, they toppled outward, landing heavily on the carpet. The scraping and thudding jolted my nerves like a shockwave. I felt my stomach twist, and my hands began to shake uncontrollably. The lamp flickered more intensely, casting dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. I whispered a plea under my breath, though I'm not sure to whom I was speaking. I begged for this presence to stop, to let me be. I cannot fully articulate the sheer terror of not knowing what you're dealing with. There was nothing to fight, no face to confront, only an oppressive force that could manipulate the very objects around me. My rational mind refused to shut down, and that almost made it worse. I was constantly trying to find logic in an utterly illogical situation. When the lamp's bulb finally burned out with a soft pop, I found myself in near darkness. My eyes adjusted just in time to see a black shape dart into the hallway, or so I thought. I called out, demanding that it reveal itself, but the only response was the echo of my own voice in the silence. By now, every nerve in my body was strung taut. A cold sweat had drenched my shirt, and my pulse was a wild hammering in my ears. I fumbled my way to the light switch, only to discover it no longer worked. Adrenaline spiked, and I stumbled toward my bedroom, grabbing my flashlight. I stood in the bedroom doorway, shining the shaky beam into the corridor. The beam caught a fleeting movement, a blur of motion along the wall. My mouth went dry, my fingers numb against the flashlight's grip. In that moment, I knew I had to do something drastic. Over the following week, I made arrangements to leave. Sleep was a lost cause, and my attempts to reason with or ignore the presence had failed miserably. The last night I spent there was the worst. Every sound felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were reverberating with silent energy. Around 3 a.m., I awoke to a soft dragging noise in the living room. I forced myself to check it out. The coffee table had been moved several inches from where it usually stood, and atop it lay 3 objects: my glasses, a small porcelain figurine that should have been in shards in the trash, and an old photograph I didn't recall ever displaying. My legs felt like they were going to give out. The figurine was whole, no sign of its previous break. That made no sense. A wave of dread like iced water washed over me. The photograph showed my own face, but with an expression I couldn't remember making. I looked terrified in the picture, eyes wide, lips parted slightly as though mid-scream. Realizing I was dealing with something beyond my comprehension, I packed a bag and left before dawn. My entire body trembled as I drove away. Though my hands were on the steering wheel, my mind was still trapped in that oppressive apartment. I relocated to a motel across town, convinced that if I left, the incidents would stop. For a short while, I felt a sense of relief. My heartbeat gradually slowed to a more normal pace, and I breathed easier. Yet the sense of being watched never fully left me. Even at the motel, I sometimes woke up feeling as though someone hovered at the edge of my bed. Every now and then, I would hear a subtle thump that reminded me of books tumbling to the floor. My mind spiraled, questioning whether I had truly escaped the presence or if it had latched onto me somehow. I'd stare into the mirror, analyzing the reflection for any sign of distortion, half expecting to see that same horrified expression from the photograph. I returned to the apartment during daylight hours to grab more of my belongings, accompanied by a property manager who insisted that the building was structurally sound and that the occasional draft was normal. But no matter how many times he repeated his reassurances, I knew that something unexplainable lingered in those rooms. As I gathered my boxes, I kept a watchful eye on the shelves, anticipating another book falling or another figurine sliding of its own accord. Oddly, nothing happened in those moments, as if the apartment was mocking me by withholding its manifestations. When I finally turned in my key, I felt a fleeting sense of closure, but a deeper apprehension clung to me like a second skin. I sensed that the presence, or the memory of it, was still lurking, just out of sight, waiting. Even now, in a different residence, there are times when I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, or hear a quiet scraping in an empty room, or feel a soft breath on my neck in the dead of night. My chest tightens at these signs and a prickly heat sweeps across my skin. I try to convince myself it's only the echo of what I endured, just the remnants of trauma that refuse to fade away. But in those lonely moments, when the lights are low and my mind drifts back to that oppressive apartment, I can't escape the notion that I never truly left it behind. I carry that unsettling weight with me. The final revelation, or perhaps the final cruelty, is that sometimes there is no neat resolution. There is only the lingering dread that something beyond our understanding can brush up against us, changing our lives in ways we can't fully articulate. Sometimes escape only means putting physical distance between yourself and the unknown, while your mind remains trapped in that place of terror. No matter how many miles I travel or how many years pass, the memory of that breath on my neck, the remote skittering across the table, and the impossible reappearance of broken porcelain will forever remain etched in my psyche. And in the quiet hours, when the world sleeps and shadows claim the corners of the room, I still brace for the slightest shift of an object, that subtle sign I am once again not alone. The heat of the afternoon sun bore into my shoulders as I coasted to a stop, my tires crunching over the gravel at the edge of the forest trail. That searing warmth, which should have been comforting after a good ride, felt oppressive, like a spotlight aimed directly at me, exposing my every move to watchful eyes in the trees. My breath hitched in my throat, an unfamiliar tightness in my chest, as if the forest itself was exhaling a long, low sigh. I'm a 30-something man who's always turned to cycling for an escape. With each rotation of the pedals, I usually find a sense of calm, a rhythm that blocks out the chaos of everyday life. This particular stretch of trail had become my favorite getaway. It cuts through a rolling landscape of dense pines and ancient oaks that creak and sway, even on windless days. The forest floor is often carpeted with needles and scattered leaves, muffling the sounds of passing animals. Normally, it's serene, a refuge of cool shadows and softly filtered sunlight. But that day, the hush felt off, like a silence imposed rather than a natural stillness. I dismounted to take a breather, leaning my bike against a crooked tree trunk. My legs buzzed with the pleasant fatigue that follows a long ride, but my mind refused to settle. My ears caught something faint, perhaps just on the edge of hearing, a soft humming. I froze for a moment, trying to discern if it was the wind or something else. The sound was low, rhythmic, almost like a chant. It came from within the trees, deeper in the gloom where the sun's rays couldn't reach. I remember a chill settling in my spine. In broad daylight, with birds chirping overhead, I had no reason to fear. Yet my heart pounded harder than it had on the steepest part of the trail. At first I tried to shrug it off. The forest plays tricks, and I've been startled before by rustling animals or the distant hoot of an owl. But something about that droning hum tugged at me. It was as though multiple voices were layered atop one another, blending into a single, unsettling note. Not quite melodic, not exactly chaotic, just a whispering choir that made my skin prickle. My hands felt clammy on the straps of my backpack, and I realized my breaths were turning shallow. I decided, maybe foolishly, that I had to know what it was. I propped my helmet on my handlebars and crept into the shadows, each footstep accompanied by the crunch of twigs and the rustle of dried leaves. With every few steps forward, the chanting grew clearer, though it never got loud. It remained a hushed murmuring that vibrated through the air, making my stomach lurch with unease. The deeper I went, the darker it became, as if the sun was being siphoned away. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and the dryness in my mouth forced me to swallow again and again to keep my throat from closing. Suddenly, I was blinded by a flash of purple light. It sliced through the dimness like a blade, casting elongated shadows on the mossy ground. I blinked furiously, spots dancing across my vision. Then, as quickly as it came, the light vanished. The chanting stopped. An oppressive quiet descended, somehow heavier than before. My limbs quaked with tension, and my skin felt cold despite the sweat trickling down my back. I scanned the area, the hair on my neck bristling with the unshakable feeling that something, was behind me. I turned slowly, nerves aflame. There was no one there, just a thick trunk coated in patches of lichen, gnarled roots, and the hush of the forest. Yet that presence remained, massive and unmistakable, pressing on my senses like a weight on my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed that there was a towering form just beyond my line of sight, hovering in the shadows, watching me. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My legs threatened to buckle, and I grabbed at a nearby branch to steady myself. My breathing grew ragged, and I took a slow, deliberate inhale to try to calm the panic surging inside. In that moment, I felt certain that if I turned around again, I would see something too large, too hideous, too impossible to comprehend. But curiosity, and maybe a trace of stubbornness, forced me to twist my head. All I saw were the same ragged silhouettes of tree trunks, the same thick labyrinth of branches. No shapes out of place, no silhouettes that might betray a lurking figure. Nothing except an odd smell that drifted past my nose, vaguely metallic like old coins or iron-laced air. My stomach twisted, and I gagged once before forcing my composure back into place. My instincts told me to get out of there. The chanting was gone, replaced by a hush so deep my own heartbeat rang in my ears. I half stumbled, half ran back to where I had left my bike. I expected to see it standing there, untouched, exactly as I had left it. Instead, I found something that sent a jolt of pure fear through my system. Wet handprints on the handlebars. Large, elongated fingers traced across the metal, dripping a clear, viscous fluid onto the ground. My breath caught in my throat, a startled half-choke that burned my lungs. I glanced around, expecting to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, had done this. But there was nothing except a faint rustling sound, as though something was sliding through the underbrush. That sound curled around me like a living thing, raising every hair on my body. My heart thudded against my ribcage so fiercely that I thought it might bruise. I forced myself to grip the bike, ignoring how the handlebars felt damp and strangely sticky. I wiped my palms on my shorts, but the sensation of moisture clung to my fingers, as if stained on my skin. I hurried to put my helmet back on, though my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. My entire body felt electrified with a restless dread, a tension that made it nearly impossible to think straight. For a second, I couldn't remember which direction led back to the main trail. The forest can feel like a labyrinth when you're anxious and breathing too fast to focus. Finally, I spotted the faint line of gravel through a gap in the trees and pedaled away, my legs burning with the effort of quick acceleration. The rustling that followed me was maddening. It never grew louder, never faded completely, always kept pace just at the edge of my awareness, like a presence skulking behind each tree. Sometimes it sounded like leaves brushing against bark, other times like a hushed footstep on soft ground. Sweat poured down my temples, cold and briny, stinging my eyes. Every muscle in my torso was clenched, my lungs laboring to pull in enough air to keep me stable. I felt hyper-aware of every root, every rock beneath my tires, as though a single misstep might bring me face to face with whatever lurked in that forest. I didn't stop until I broke through the final patch of trees and onto the open road that led back into town. My entire body was shaking with an adrenaline overload. I leaned forward on the handlebars, chest heaving, trying to calm the frantic pounding in my ears. When I glanced down at the metal, the wet handprints were gone, evaporated or perhaps absorbed into the material. There wasn't even a stain. A tremor rippled through me as I recalled the distinct shape of those fingers, the water-like droplets trickling onto the ground. It left me questioning whether I had imagined it all, but my memory insisted it was real. I could have gone straight home, locked my doors, and buried myself under the covers. Instead, I rode into the nearest convenience store to grab water and force my rattled nerves to settle. I remember the cashier asking if I was okay, more in the sense of idle courtesy than genuine concern, and I just mumbled that I'd had a rough trail ride. I avoided direct eye contact, feeling my heart race all over again as I replayed the events in my head. I'm sure my face was pale and sweat-soaked, because the cashier's expression shifted from casual to unsettled. He quietly suggested I rest for a moment, so I stood by a rack of energy bars, trying to slow my breathing. My reflection in the store's window looked haunted, with eyes open just a fraction too wide, lips pressed into a thin line. That night, I slept fitfully. Shadows in my bedroom seemed to move on their own, swaying in time with the recollection of that eerie chanting. Each time I managed to drift off, I dreamed of an enormous silhouette lurking at the edge of my vision, a heavy shape made of tangled branches and purple lightning. I would jolt awake, a sheen of sweat clinging to my skin, heart hammering in my chest. No matter how often I turned on the lamp to assure myself I was alone, a sense of being watched never left me. For days, I avoided the forest. My usual morning rides felt wrong, like an invitation to something I wasn't ready to face. I tried taking other routes on quieter streets, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I was being trailed. As I pedaled through empty roads, a soft static seemed to scratch at the back of my mind, reminding me of that day, that purple flash, those wet handprints. My sleep remained disturbed, and I began to see movements in my peripheral vision. I'd swivel my head, only to find empty corners. Doors in my apartment felt slightly ajar even when I was sure I had closed them. A faint, almost imperceptible odor of iron lingered in the air at night. I tried to talk myself down. Perhaps I was experiencing some kind of stress-induced paranoia. I told a friend indirectly about having a strange encounter in the woods. No details, just that something had spooked me. They suggested it could have been a vagrant or an animal, and that my mind might have filled in the blanks. I latched onto that explanation for sanity's sake, but at the core of my being, I knew it was something else. Something I couldn't name, that logic couldn't explain away. About a week later, I made the decision to confront my fear. I was tired of living with the sensation that every passing shadow was the start of another nightmare. If I went back, maybe I'd prove to myself it was all some bizarre hallucination brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination. That's what I told myself. Deep down, dread coiled in my stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. The late afternoon sun cast elongated shapes across the trail when I arrived at the forest entrance again. My hands shook on the handlebars, and every turn of the pedals seemed louder than it should have been. Birds twittered overhead, their songs somehow sounding wrong. The air felt thick, almost too heavy to inhale. I pushed forward, telling myself that if something was truly there, I'd see it with clear eyes this time. The deeper I went, the more my skin prickled. My head throbbed with each push of the pedals, and the taste of metal lingered on my tongue. The shadows beneath the trees felt alive, shifting in unnatural patterns. I began to sense a flicker of purple in the corner of my eye, but whenever I looked directly, it vanished. My breath rasped through my teeth, my arms clammy, and the tension in my neck made it hard to turn my head without wincing. As I rounded a bend, the forest canopy thickened, and the temperature seemed to plummet. My teeth chattered briefly, more from nerves than cold, but the chill was palpable. That's when I heard it. The chanting, low and rhythmic, just as before. It started as a faint hum, building slowly, surrounding me in layers of dissonant whispers. My heart pounded so fiercely I worried I'd pass out. I dismounted and let the bike rest on the trail. The chanting was calling me deeper again, or maybe it was just echoing from all directions. My mind told me to turn around, to flee, but my legs moved forward on their own. Each step was followed by a snap of twigs, the crunch of leaves, and an internal chorus of panic begging me to stop. My stomach clenched, my breath shallow and rapid. Then I saw it, a shimmering slash of purple light in the air, just like before, except this time it lingered. It looked like a tear in reality, jagged around the edges and pulsating with an otherworldly glow. The chanting swelled, the forest dimmed. My entire body vibrated with tension, sweat pouring down my brow. I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to work. As I edged closer, the chanting suddenly ceased. The rip in the air flickered, and I sensed that massive presence behind me once more. My scalp tingled, my arms locked at my sides. Fear hammered at my chest, but I forced myself to turn around. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something. An impossible shape draped in shadows taller than any tree, head tilted as if observing me from above. A surge of nausea twisted my gut. My vision blurred, the shape flickered, and then it was gone. The rustling returned, echoing around me, and I darted back toward my bike. I expected to find it covered in those damp handprints again, but it was untouched. Only the seat was slightly askew, as though someone had tried to sit on it. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized that my entire body was trembling so hard I could barely steady the bike. I launched myself onto the seat and pedaled as fast as I could. The trees flashed by in streaks of green and brown, and that rustling sound stayed with me, never growing distant, never drawing closer, just an ever-present reminder that I wasn't alone. My lungs burned as I shot out of the forest and onto the open road, not daring to glance back. When I finally slowed, a dull ache spread through my chest. My hands felt numb, as though the handlebar grips were made of ice. I couldn't escape the sense that the presence was still near me, maybe just out of sight, hidden behind a corner of reality. The chanting echoed in my head long after I left the trees behind. Even in the direct sunlight, I felt drenched in darkness, a darkness that clung to my thoughts and pried open every hidden fear. In the days that followed, I found no clear answers to what happened in that forest. Yet the memory haunts me relentlessly. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a brief flicker of purple. Late at night, that rustling noise seems to echo from beneath my window, coaxing my pulse into a feverish rhythm. My dreams remain haunted by the giant silhouette looming behind me, beckoning me to turn around, to gaze upon something I can't possibly understand without losing my grip on sanity. I haven't gone back to that trail since, and a part of me wonders if the forest let me leave, or if it's only a matter of time before it calls me again. Each day, I wake with the memory of that chanting echoing in my mind, the tactile phantom of wet handprints clinging to my skin, and the imprint of a presence so vast it couldn't belong to this world. Rationality tells me to move on, to leave it in the realm of nightmares. But deep down, I sense that the barrier between that place and the one I inhabit has thinned, and I can't be sure I'm free. Even now, describing it, I feel my heart rate spike and beads of sweat form along my hairline. My hands tremble slightly on the keyboard. I catch the scent of iron in the air, though I can't find its source, and a wave of paranoia tightens my chest. It's as though the forest is reminding me it's still there, waiting with that shimmering purple tear in reality. The next time I might not have the resolve, or the luck, to escape. And so I live day to day, hoping that the rustling in the shadows remains just that, a sound with no form. But some nights I swear I sense that towering presence inches behind me, breath heavy and foreign against my neck, ready to reclaim what it once touched. I choose not to turn around, because the truth is, a part of me knows exactly what I'd see. The moment I set foot inside this house, I felt something coil in the pit of my stomach, as if the shadows along the hallway stretched just a little too far to greet me. There was a smell of stale air, a faint trace of damp wood, and an intangible presence pressing against my skin. I convinced myself I was imagining things. An older place might have a few quirks after all. but there was a particular heaviness to the atmosphere, a sense that every inch of the house held its breath the way I was trying to hold mine. My heart pounded with each tentative step, and I remember feeling more like an intruder than a tenant. That night, before I even unpacked my suitcases, I knew something wasn't quite right. I moved here shortly after a big change in my life that I'd rather not dwell on. The landlord had advertised it as a furnished rental, complete with worn armchairs and antique shelves. I found those details charming at first. I've always been drawn to things with a history, so the chipped paint on the walls and the creaking wooden floorboards didn't deter me. In fact, when the landlord showed me around, my focus darted straight to three peculiar items: an old locket that looked like a reliquary from a museum, a small bronze statue on the highest shelf, and a tiny pocket mirror lying innocuously on a side table. My curiosity stirred, but I asked nothing at the time, because the landlord gave me an uneasy glance whenever my eyes lingered on them. He merely muttered that the previous tenant was a collector of curiosities and suggested I treat the pieces with caution. A chill settled in my spine, but I tried to dismiss it. The first week passed in relative calm, albeit marked by strange impressions. I'd go to the kitchen for breakfast and swear I heard faint shuffling behind me, but I'd glance over my shoulder to find only the dusty corridor. At night, I thought I felt a gentle tug on my blanket, as if someone stepped by the bed. I brushed it off as my nerves adjusting to a new place, even when my hands trembled so much that I struggled to hold my evening cup of tea without spilling. My breath became shallow every time I heard an unexplained rustle or squeak. Over and over, I repeated in my mind that old houses make noise, that I should stop letting my imagination get the best of me. But each time I told myself this, a subdued sense of dread tightened its grip on my chest, quickening my heartbeat until I couldn't pretend it was normal anymore. I started noticing something off about the three objects. The reliquary, for instance, always seemed to be facing a slightly different angle whenever I passed it on the mantel. Some days the hinge was ajar, showing a mere sliver of its contents, a photograph so old it had turned yellow and brittle around the edges. One morning I found the reliquary fully open, the picture inside facing outward as if silently demanding my attention. It showed a man whose face I couldn't quite place, but his cold, dark eyes burned into me even though I had never seen him before. The moment I looked at it, my mouth went dry, and I felt a prickling sensation crawling down my spine. It was as though he was watching me from across time, judging me for invading what might have been his home. I gingerly closed the locket, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it, then backed away with a sense of shame, as if I'd invaded someone else's private memory. Next, there was the little pocket mirror. It lay on a side table in the living room, next to some dusty magazines that the previous tenant had left behind. I didn't touch it. Every time I glanced in its direction, an uneasy reflection of my own eyes stared back. The glass was slightly warped, creating an odd distortion that made my face look hollow-cheeked, as though something were draining the life out of me. Over several evenings, I could swear the mirror was no longer on the table but on the coffee stand, or perched on a windowsill, and each time, I convinced myself I must have moved it, or absent-mindedly placed it somewhere else. But the unsettling truth was that I had no recollection of ever handling it. My heart pounded so fiercely whenever I noticed its new resting spot that I'd feel my temples throb and a bead of sweat run down my back. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I needed more sleep. Maybe stress was getting to me. Yet in the back of my mind, I understood something unnatural was happening. The bronze statue was perhaps the most unnerving of the three. It depicted a robed figure, with its face partially eroded by time, leaving only hollow contours where the features should be. Its position on the highest shelf looked stable enough that even if the house shifted in high winds, it shouldn't budge. However, I sometimes noticed it angled differently, turned as though it were trying to watch me the way I kept a wary eye on it. One particularly calm evening, I walked into the living room and found the statue at the edge of the shelf, as if it had slid forward of its own accord. My immediate reaction was to step back, pulse hammering in my neck. I tried nudging the shelf, expecting a wobble that might explain its movement, but the piece of furniture barely rocked. The statue, though, was poised precariously, threatening to fall with the slightest touch. I gently pushed it back to its original spot, my hand sweating against the cold bronze. The sensation of the metal against my palm was disturbing. It felt hotter than it should have, almost as though it had retained body heat. Despite these strange happenings, life carried on. I attempted to work at my desk in the next room, typing furiously to drown out the growing anxiety inside me. I slept in fits, tossing and turning, always aware of an unshakable presence just beyond my bedroom door. Sometimes I'd hear slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, followed by a near silence that felt loaded with intention. My throat would tighten, and I'd break out in a thin layer of sweat, heart racing. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling. My rational mind fought a losing battle with the creeping paranoia that I was living among silent, watchful entities. Whenever I tried to rest, those creeping sensations of being observed would intensify, culminating in a racing pulse that made it almost impossible to sleep. Things escalated one night when I was reading in the living room. The reliquary, which I had firmly closed that morning, stood open again on the mantel. The photograph inside stared at me with an almost accusatory glare. I felt an unexpected surge of anger, as if I were being toyed with, so I took the reliquary in my hand and snapped it shut with more force than necessary. Almost immediately, a frigid breeze swept through the room, rustling the curtains. My neck hair stood up as though an invisible current had wrapped itself around me. In that moment, it felt personal, like I had offended someone or something that demanded I show respect. My hands began to tremble violently, and I had to set the reliquary down before I dropped it. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart galloping in my chest. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead, and for the first time, I realized I was well past the boundary of ordinary explanations. As I struggled to fall asleep that same night, I felt eyes on me again, as if the occupant of the house, whether living or not, was standing right outside my bedroom. I heard that maddening shuffle of light footsteps crossing the hallway floorboards. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I lay stiff as a board under the covers, perspiration breaking out all over my skin. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless slumber. In the early hours of the morning, I awoke to an odd thud. My heart pounded erratically, and my mouth went instantly dry. I left the comfort of my bed, stepping out into the corridor. It took all my resolve to shuffle forward, my feet feeling like lead. The living room was bathed in a faint glow from a streetlight outside the window, and I immediately noticed the bronze statue on the floor. It had rolled off the shelf to land on the rug. At that precise instant, I heard a muffled scream echo through the house. I froze, blood roaring in my ears. My vision swam with panic, yet my senses sharpened. The darkness in the corners seemed to cling to the walls, and there was a nauseating feeling of being crowded by unseen spectators. My chest tightened as I listened intently. The scream hadn't come from outside, but from somewhere within these walls. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I flicked on the living room light, only to discover that the pocket mirror was missing from its usual spot on the side table. My pulse was racing so intensely that I felt dizzy. I heard another faint scuffle, like someone's quick steps on the hallway floor. I followed the noise, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached the next room. The door stood half open, and the only illumination was the glow from a distant street lamp through the window. Inside, on a dusty old armchair, lay the pocket mirror. Its reflective surface pointed toward the corridor, as if waiting for me to pick it up. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The hush in the room felt oppressive, and my own heartbeat seemed to thunder in my ears. My fingers trembled as I reached for the mirror. I expected a reflection of my terrified face, but in that warped glass, I saw a fleeting image that didn't belong to me at all. It looked like the same man from the reliquary, a face contorted by something akin to rage or desperation. My whole body jolted with cold shock, and I nearly dropped the mirror. Then the image vanished, leaving only my terrified expression behind. From that moment on, my sense of reality began to slip. My sleep, already poor, turned into a series of fragmented dozes punctuated by whispered noises and shifting shadows. I felt eyes on me at all times, especially near the antique items. My attempts to contact the landlord turned into confusing exchanges, where he only insisted that the house had a reputation, but never elaborated. He implied that the previous tenant was extremely attached to those objects, and that they might be energetically charged. He didn't use those exact words, but the implication was clear enough. My stomach sank every time I recalled that conversation. It felt as if I were locked in an inheritance that I never asked for. Gradually, I became convinced that the house itself was guiding the reliquary, mirror, and statue, or that some presence used them as channels. I reached a point where I barely recognized my own reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning. I looked sunken, tense, as though I'd aged several years in mere weeks. Sometimes a faint knock on the walls would start at around 3 in the morning. My heart would thud violently, and sweat would break out on my upper lip. I could never locate the source of these knocks, and they always stopped the moment I mustered the courage to investigate. At one stage, I caught myself pacing the length of the hallway multiple times each night, checking every corner for intruders I knew logically weren't there. Still, the intangible sense of being watched never left, and my chest tightened more every day. One evening, when I could no longer bear the constant dread, I decided I had to confront whatever lurked here, or leave for good. My body was trembling, my thoughts frayed. I took the reliquary off the mantel, the photo still tucked inside, and carried it to the center of the living room. My hands were clammy, my breath coming in uneven spurts. My plan was to speak out loud, to demand an end to whatever game was being played, but my throat felt constricted, and I could manage only a broken whisper. I declared that I wanted no part of this history, that I respected whatever or whoever remained here, but needed peace. My voice cracked on the final words, and a sudden surge of cold air rushed through the room again. A sense of heaviness pressed against me, as if something was deciding whether to strike or relent. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I glimpsed a figure standing behind me in the reflection of the pocket mirror on the shelf. My heart hammered as though it would burst, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. When the lights settled, there was nothing there. Somehow I found the strength to gather all 3 objects in a box and store them in a cramped closet at the far end of the hallway. My logic told me it might not help, but a desperate part of me hoped removing them from my sight would restore a sliver of sanity. That night, I felt lighter, though I still shivered with residual fear. The footsteps receded, the knocks ceased, and I dared to let myself sleep. My dreams were disjointed fragments of an old house, an unknown man's face, and a reflection that never matched my own. When I woke to the faint glow of dawn, I realized the air felt different, less stifling, as though the house itself exhaled a weary sigh. I hesitantly crept to the closet, half expecting the door to be open or the box to be empty. But it was sealed, exactly as I had left it, and the house, for once, was silent. I wish I could say I felt completely safe from that moment on, but that wouldn't be true. There's still a lingering tension in the corridors, an echo of that muffled scream in the dead of night. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at the closet door, heart pounding with the recollection of the terror I experienced. Even now, the memory of that distorted face in the mirror haunts me, and I have to remind myself I'm awake and grounded in reality. I haven't moved out yet, though the urge to do so is growing. Perhaps I've grown stubborn or too curious for my own good, wondering if this place might eventually offer answers I can't get anywhere else. Or maybe some part of me hopes that by enduring these chills and restless nights, I'll finally unravel the mystery of who that man in the photograph is, and why his spirit, or whatever piece of him remains, clings to these halls. No matter what comes next, this house has left a mark on me. My hands still tremble when I think about that statue rolling off the shelf. My throat tightens when I recall the pocket mirror's unsettling reflections, and my stomach churns whenever my mind drifts to the reliquary with its ghostly photo. The nights remain heavy and watchful, but at least now I know I can endure it. Whether I choose to leave tomorrow or stay a little longer, I've learned that some doors in life open to mysteries best left alone. And sometimes, the only real choice is to face the darkness, breath ragged, heart pounding, refusing to be consumed by it. Because even when confronted with the unknown, the pulse of survival can outrun fear, if only by a few ragged beats.